This is Park Ranger Files. Every word tonight came straight from a subscriber, and I read them to you as honestly as I can. Some are strange, some are sad, and every one of them belongs to somebody who was there and I wasn't. Let's begin. Story 1. I drove a delivery route through the Redwoods for 11 years, and I want to start by saying I am the last person who should be writing a letter like this. I am not a believer in much. I believe in my truck, my schedule, and getting home to my wife by 6. That's about the whole of my faith. So when I tell you what happened on the Avenue of the Giants, you should weigh it against the fact that I spent 11 years driving through those trees in the dark and the fog, and I never once let myself get spooked, because a spooked driver is a slow driver, and a slow driver doesn't make his stops, and I always made my stops. For those who've never been up there, I should explain the country a little, because the country is most of the story. You've got these redwoods, the coast redwoods, and there is nothing I can say that will make you understand the size of them, unless you've stood at the bottom of one and looked up and felt your stomach drop the way it does at the edge of a cliff, except you're looking up instead of down. They go up 300 feet. Some of them were alive before the Romans, and they grow close in these dense stands, so that even at noon on a bright day, the light comes down green and underwater and dim, and the road threads between them like a tunnel, and your headlights at night just get swallowed. The fog comes in off the coast and pools in the low spots, and you'll come around a bend into a wall of it, and the whole world goes to milk. I knew that road the way you know the inside of your own house. I could have driven most of it with my eyes shut. And I'll mention, because it bears on the rest, that the drivers who ran those northern routes were a tight bunch. And we talked at the depots, over coffee, the way men with long, lonely routes do. And there were things we passed around about certain stretches. Not ghost stories exactly. We'd have been embarrassed to call them that. Just practical lore. Don't take the river road after a hard rain. Watch for elk on the such and such grade at dusk. And there were a couple of the deep woods stops that the older drivers would get a particular tone about. Would say, "You running the lodge route in November?" And when you said yes, they'd say, "Mind how you go back there late and not explain." And you'd think they meant the road, the fog, the dark, the practical hazards. I thought that's what they meant for years. It was only after my own nights out there that I understood the older drivers had been telling me something more than watch the road, that mind how you go back there. Late was the same kind of warning as the old rancher's rule about his hill. A thing passed driver to driver, worn smooth from saying. That meant more than it said, and that I'd been hearing it for years at the coffee machine, without knowing I was being warned. The stop I'm going to tell you about was a regular one, a little cluster of cabins and a lodge set back in the trees, the kind of place that takes deliveries twice a week. I ran it for years. There was an old fellow who ran the lodge, and I'd hand him his boxes, and we'd talk about the weather and the tourists, and that was the rhythm of it. Nothing strange about the place at all. I want to be clear about that. It was an ordinary stop on an ordinary route. It was November, late in the day, the light already going. November up there, the dark comes early and it comes complete. No city glow to soften it, just black between the trunks. I was running behind because of a downed limb that had held up traffic on the main road, and so I came to the lodge turnoff later than I ever had, full dark, fog sitting in the hollows. And I made the turn onto the access road, this narrow paved lane that runs maybe half a mile back through the biggest trees on the property. And about halfway down it, my headlights picked up a kid standing at the side of the road. A boy, maybe 8, maybe 10, hard to say. Standing right at the edge of the pavement in the fog with his arms down at his sides, just standing there, looking at the road. And my first thought was nothing supernatural at all. My first thought was that some tourist family had let their kid wander off, and I was about to have a very bad situation if I didn't slow down. so I slowed down. I came almost to a stop, maybe 20 feet from him, and I rolled my window down to call out and ask if he was lost. Where were his folks? And here's the first thing that was wrong. And it's a small thing, but it's the thing that started the cold going up my back. He was dressed wrong. Not wrong for a kid, wrong for the year. He had on this little wool coat, buttoned up in short pants, and these high-laced boots, the kind of thing you'd see in an old photograph, like a kid from 100 years ago. And I remember my brain trying to make it ordinary, trying to tell me it was a costume, that there'd been some Pioneer Day event at one of the lodges. Kids do that. And even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't right, because the clothes weren't clean and new the way a costume is. They looked worn. They looked like he'd been wearing them a long time. I called out to him. I said something like, "Hey buddy, you okay? Where's your mom and dad?" And he didn't answer. He just looked at me. And then he raised one arm and pointed down the road, further down the access road, away from the lodge, into a part of the property I knew for a fact didn't have anything in it but trees, because the access road dead-ended at the lodge, and the rest was just forest going back to the ridge. He pointed down there, into the dark, and the trees where there was nothing, and he held the point, and he looked at me like he wanted me to understand something. I should have just driven to the lodge. I know that now. But you have to understand, every instinct I have as a person, as a father myself, said you do not leave a child standing alone in the freezing dark in the middle of the woods. So I put the truck in park, and I started to open my door to go to him, to get him in the cab, where it was warm, and drive him up to the lodge and sort out whose he was. And the old man who ran the lodge was suddenly there at my window. I never saw him come. That's the part I can't explain and have stopped trying to. The access road was empty. I'd have seen headlights. I'd have seen a flashlight. It was pitch black, and there was no way for a man to come down that road on foot without me seeing him. And yet there he was at my window, out of breath like he'd run. And he put his hand flat on my door so I couldn't open it, and he said, low and fast and dead serious, "Don't get out. Look at me. Look at my face, not at him. Drive up to the lodge. Now." And something in his voice did it. I looked at him, I kept my eyes on his face, and I took my hand off the door handle. And I put the truck in drive, and I went up to the lodge, slow, and the boy didn't move. He just turned his head and watched me go by, still pointing down the road the whole time. And I did not look at him again because the old man had told me not to. And I had decided in that moment that I was going to do exactly what the old man said. Up at the lodge, the old man came in behind me and shut the door and poured himself a drink with hands that weren't quite steady. And I asked him what the hell that was. Whose kid was that? And he looked at me for a long moment, and then he told me. He said the boy had been there a long time, longer than him, and he'd run the lodge 30 years. He said the story, the one the old families up there told, was that there'd been a logging camp on that ground back near the turn of the century, and a boy had wandered off from it and never been found, and that he turned up now and again at the side of that road, at the dark end of the year, always pointing down the road, away from where the people were. And then the old man told me the thing I've carried with me ever since, the reason I left that route the next spring and never drove it again. He said the ones who get out of their cars, the ones who follow the pointing, the ones who go down the road to where the boy is pointing to see what he wants them to see, don't come back the same. He said one of them, years back, a younger fellow had gone down there, had walked off down the access road into the trees following that pointing arm, and had come back 2 hours later, walked back up to the lodge on his own and seemed fine, and drove home, and was never right again. Quit his job, stopped talking to people, and a year later was gone. And the old man wouldn't say, "Gone how?" Just gone. And he said he'd made it his business, after that, to watch for headlights at the dark end of the year. and to get down to that road fast when somebody came late, because the boy doesn't point for nothing. And whatever's down there at the end of the boy's arm is not something a person should go and see. I saw the boy one more time before I left the route, and I'll tell you about it, because it's the thing that actually made me quit more than the first night. It was the next November, almost a year later. The old man at the lodge had told me after that first night that if I ever came late in the dark season again and saw the boy, I was to flash my lights twice and he'd come down. That was our signal. And I thought it was an old man being dramatic, but I'd said sure. And sure enough, the next November, I came down that access road late, full dark, and there the boy was. Same spot, same little wool coat, same worn boots, arm already coming up to point down the road into the trees. But this time was different. And the difference is what I can't get out of my head. This time, when my headlights hit him, he wasn't pointing down the road. He was pointing at my truck. At me. And as I slowed, his arm tracked me, stayed pointed right at my cab as I rolled closer. And his face, which the first year had been blank, just blank and sad. His face this time was doing something. It was scared, the boy looked scared, and his mouth was moving. He was saying something over and over that I couldn't hear through the glass. And I made myself not roll the window down. I made myself remember the old man saying, "Keep your eyes on a living face." Except there was no living face this time. There was just me and the boy, and I flashed my lights twice like we'd agreed. And the old man didn't come. I waited and I flashed again, and he didn't come. And the boy kept pointing at me and mouthing his silent word and looking more and more afraid. And finally, I just drove. I drove up to the lodge fast, with the boy's pointing arm tracking me the whole way. And I got up there and the lodge was dark. All of it. No lights, no smoke from the chimney, and the old man's truck gone. And I sat in the dark lot with my heart going. And I realized the boy hadn't been pointing me down the road that night. He'd been pointing at me to turn around, to leave. Because the old man wasn't there, the lodge was empty. And whatever the boy stood guard against, there was nobody there to come and put a hand on my door if I needed it. And the boy knew it, and the boy, the thing I'd been afraid of, had been trying to warn me to get out. I found out later the old man had been taken to the hospital that very week, his heart, the thing that would kill him not long after. He hadn't been at the lodge in days, and the boy had known. The boy had stood at the side of that road in the cold and tried to tell me, "You shouldn't be here tonight. There's no one here to keep you safe tonight. Go back." And I'd been so busy being afraid of him that I almost didn't understand. That's when I knew the old man had been right all along. That the boy isn't the danger, the boy is the warning. And that year the warning was for me, and the boy spent it scared for me, pointing me home. And I never went up that road again. I never found out what was down there. I want to be honest about that because I know it's the thing you want to know. It's the thing I'd want to know if I were listening to this. I don't know. I never went and looked. And I'm glad I never went and looked. And the old man is gone now himself. Passed a few years back, and the lodge changed hands, and I don't know if the boy still stands at the side of that road in November, pointing down it, but I'll tell you what I believe, for whatever a delivery driver's belief is worth. I believe the boy isn't the danger. I believe the boy is the warning. I think that child, whatever's left of him, stands out there in the cold, trying to point people away from a thing. Or maybe toward it. I genuinely can't tell which. And I think the old man understood that the only safe thing to do is not find out. To keep your eyes on a living face and drive on past, and let the boy point at the dark all he wants. I think about him every November, that little wool coat, those worn out boots. And I'm grateful every year for an old man I barely knew who came out of nowhere and put his hand on my door and told me not to get out, because I was getting out. I had my hand on the handle, and I will never know what I'd have walked into down that road, and that not knowing is the best thing that ever happened to me. A quick word, call to action 1 of 3. If these are doing it for you, the kindest thing you can do is hit subscribe and let the video keep playing while you go about your evening. It genuinely helps the channel more than you'd think. And if you've got an account of your own, the submissions address is down in the description. I read everyone that comes in, even the ones I can't use. All right, back to it. Story 2. Okay, so I've never written one of these, and my hands are honestly a little shaky doing it, so bear with me if it comes out weird. I'm 22. This happened over spring break this year, like 2 months ago, so it's real fresh, and maybe that's why I finally wanted to get it out of my head and onto something. Me and 3 friends went out to Joshua Tree. You've probably seen it on Instagram. Everybody's been. It's the desert park with the weird spiky trees that look like something Dr. Seuss drew, and the giant piles of round boulders everywhere that look like God stacked them. It's genuinely one of the most beautiful places I've ever been, and I need to say that first because I don't want this to come off like the desert is bad or scary. It's not. It's stunning. It's just that something happened out there that I can't explain, and it's been sitting on me. Okay, one thing I found out after that I have to put in here because it freaks me out every time I think about it. When we drove out the next morning, the gray dawn, leaving early, the campground was emptier than it should have been. Like I said, there'd been other campers when we got there, families, a couple of vans, people around. It was a normal, busy campground. And that morning, driving out, a bunch of the sites that had been occupied were just empty, packed up and gone, before dawn, on what should have been the middle of their trips. And at the time, I didn't think much. People leave early. But I went on one of the park forums later, way later, when I was trying to figure out what we'd heard, and I found other people, a few of them, describing leaving that same campground in the night or at first light, packing up in the dark and going. And not all of them said why, but a couple did, and a couple described almost exactly what we heard. The wordless voice, the circling. And one person wrote something that stuck in my head. They said, by the time you decide to leave, you notice you're not the only site that decided to leave. That on the bad nights, the campground quietly empties out before dawn. Everybody who heard it packing up and slipping away in the dark without talking to each other. Because what would you even say? And I realized that's what we'd seen driving out, all those empty sites. Other people who'd heard it too, and left without a word. And that it must happen more than anybody admits. A whole campground of strangers, all separately deciding in the dark that they're done, and none of them ever telling each other why. We were car camping, which means you drive in and camp at an actual campsite with a fire ring and a pit toilet a little ways off. Very normal, very safe. There were other campers around us, families even. We weren't doing anything hardcore. The plan was just to drink a little, look at the stars, which out there are insane, by the way. Like, you cannot believe how many stars there are when there's no city anywhere near. And then do some easy hiking the next day. So the first night we're sitting around the fire and it gets to be late, like 1 a.m. late. And my friends are getting tired and going to the tents one by one until it's just me up because I'm the night owl of the group. I can never sleep at a normal time. And I'm sitting there by myself watching the fire die down and looking at the stars and feeling really peaceful, actually. Really small in a good way. And I start hearing a voice. Okay, so my first thought is, it's another campsite. Sound travels weird in the desert, super far, and somebody's up talking. Totally reasonable. But the more I listen, the more I realize it's not coming from the other sites, much were behind me, back toward the road. It's coming from out in front of me, away from the campground, out into the open desert where there's nothing, just creosote and rocks and dark. And it's one voice, just one. And it's not talking to anybody. There's no back and forth. It's just going steadily on and on. Like somebody having a one-sided conversation or like somebody praying or reading out loud. And I could not make out a single word. That's the thing. It was clearly a voice, clearly a person talking. The rhythm of it was completely human, ups and downs, pauses, the cadence of somebody really saying something. but I could not catch one actual word. And not because it was too far, it wasn't far. It was the volume of somebody maybe 50 feet away. I should have been able to hear words at that distance, no problem. It was like the words were in a language I didn't know. Except it didn't sound like any language. It sounded like talking with the words sanded off, if that makes any sense. And I sat there frozen because here's what got me. It was coming closer, slowly. The whole time I sat there, it was getting just slightly louder, just slightly closer. Out there in the dark where I couldn't see anything past the edge of the firelight. This voice talking and coming toward the camp at like the speed of someone strolling. And I told myself, get up, wake somebody, get in your tent. But I genuinely could not move. I was glued to that camp chair. And I've read since that fear does that, it's a real thing, your body just locks. And that's exactly what it was. I wanted to move and my body would not do it. And then it stopped. The voice just stopped mid-sentence, mid-word almost. Right at the edge of where the firelight gave out, close, really close. Close enough that if it had been a person, I'd have been able to see at least their shape against the stars. And there was nothing there. I was staring right at the spot the voice had stopped at, and there was nothing, just dark and the dim shapes of the creosote bushes. And the silence after was so total and so sudden that my ears were ringing with it. I don't know how long I sat there not moving, a while. And then, and this is the part I really can't get past, the voice started up again. The exact same steady talking, except now it was behind me, between me and the tents. Back toward where my friends were sleeping. It had gone around. And I finally unlocked. I don't even remember deciding to. I just was suddenly up and moving. And I did not go toward the tents. Because the voice was between me and the tents. I went sideways around the fire, the long way. And I basically dove into my friend Marcus's tent and zipped it up and shook him awake. And I was shaking so hard I couldn't even explain. I just kept saying, there's somebody out there, there's somebody out there. Marcus is a really level guy, and he sat up and listened with me. And at first there was nothing, and I could see him thinking I'd had too much to drink and dreamed it. And then we both heard it, the talking. Out there, going around the tents now, slow, circling. That same wordless human voice, just talking and moving around the outside of our campsite in the dark. And I watched Marcus's face change, and that was almost the worst part, watching the level guy stop being level. Because if Marcus heard it too, then it was real, and if it was real, then I had no idea what it was. We woke the other two. We all four sat in the two tents the rest of the night. No joke, fully awake, listening to that voice circle the camp. It didn't always circle. Sometimes it would stop for 20 minutes and we'd start to relax, and then it would start up again from a totally different direction. It never came into the firelight or what was left of it. The fire was dead by then. It never tried to come in a tent. It just circled and talked, wordless, calm, patient for hours, until the sky started going gray in the east. And then sometime right around when the first real light came, it just wasn't there anymore. It didn't leave that we heard. It just stopped being there. We packed up at sunrise and left. 4 days of camping booked, and we left after one night, and nobody argued about it. Nobody even suggested staying. We just silently broke camp in the gray dawn and drove out and didn't really talk until we were back on the interstate, and then everybody talked at once. Okay, so here's the part I almost didn't include, because it makes it worse. And I've been arguing with myself about whether to even write it. On the drive out the next morning, all four of us crammed in the car, not talking. My friend Danny, who'd been in the other tent, finally said something. Real quiet. She said, "Did anyone else hear it say their name?" And the car got so silent you could hear the tires because, yeah, I had. Somewhere in the middle of that night, in the middle of all that wordless talking circling us, there'd been one moment where the voice had said my actual name, clear, the only clear word in the whole night, my name. right outside the tent, and I hadn't told anybody because I'd half convinced myself I imagined it. And it turned out all four of us had heard it say our name. Each of us our own name. Clear, once at some point in the night. The one word out of all that wordless talking that came through perfectly. And each of us had kept it to ourselves the same way, too scared to say it out loud. And the thing is, it knew our names. We'd never said our full names out loud at that campsite. We'd just been four friends using nicknames. And it had each of our real names. And it had said them to us in the dark, one at a time. Like it was trying each of us out, like it was knocking on 4 different doors to see which one would open. And Danny said the reason she brought it up was that she'd looked it up that morning on her phone when we finally got signal. And she'd found this thing about how the worst part isn't hearing the voice, it's hearing it use your name. Because that means it's not just out there talking to the night. It's talking to you specifically. It's chosen you. And she read us this line from some forum that I've never been able to forget. Somebody had written that out in the desert at night, when it finally knows your name. That's not the beginning of it noticing you. That's the end of it deciding. And we all just sat with that the whole drive home. I told my aunt about it later. She's lived in the desert towns out there her whole life. And she got quiet in a way that scared me. And she said the desert talks at night and you don't answer it. And you don't go looking for who's talking. And I said, what does that mean? Who is it? And she said it's not a who. She said people who've lived out there a long time know there's something about the open desert at night that you just leave alone. That the worst thing you can do is go out toward a sound because the sounds are bait. And she said the only reason nothing happened to us is that not one of us got up and walked out into the dark to find the voice. She said that's all it wanted. It wanted one of us to come find it. And I keep thinking about how close I came, how my body locked up and wouldn't move, and how at the time it felt like fear, like a bad thing. But my aunt said no. That was the good thing. That was the thing that saved me. Because the only version of that night where it gets me is the version where I get up out of that chair and walk out toward the voice to see who it is. And I almost did. For a second before it stopped, I almost did because part of me wanted to know so bad. And I think about that part of me a lot now. The part that wanted to go see. I don't trust it anymore. Story 3. I'll give you this account as precisely as I'm able, because precision is the only thing I have left to offer it, having failed to offer anything else useful at the time. I spent the better part of 3 decades as a hydrologist for the state, which means I studied water, where it goes, how much of it there is, how it moves through a watershed. I worked a great deal in the Sierra Nevada, the high country, measuring snowpack and stream flow, and I was as comfortable above 10,000 feet as most people are in their living rooms. I mention all this so you'll understand that I am a measuring sort of man, an empirical man, and that what I'm about to describe is not the sort of thing I have any framework for, and that its lack of a framework is precisely what has kept me turning it over for going on 20 years. There is a lake in the high Sierra that I won't name, partly out of professional discretion and partly because I'd rather no one go looking for it on my account. It sits in a granite basin above the tree line, one of those glacial tarns, very deep, very cold. The water so clear and so still on a calm day that it works like a mirror. And the peaks around it lie reversed in it so perfectly that a photograph turned upside down is indistinguishable from one turned right way up. I had a monitoring station there. Twice a year I'd hike in a long, hard day's hike with a heavy pack to service the instruments and take my readings. And I'd camp a night or two by the lake because the work took longer than a single day allowed. I had been going to that lake for years without incident. It was, if anything, my favorite sight, the most beautiful place in my entire territory, and I looked forward to the trips the way other men look forward to a holiday. The solitude up there is complete. You are above everything. The air is thin and clean, and the silence is the real high country silence, which is not an absence of sound so much as a presence of its own. a vast stillness that seems to have a texture to it. I was never lonely there. I was never uneasy there. Until the last time. I'll mention, because it bears on what came after, that I was a careful documentarian of that lake over the years. I had a long photographic record of it, dozens of frames across many seasons, the lake in its various moods, and many of them caught the mirror effect, the reversed peaks lying in the still water. After the last trip, after I had the troubling frames developed, I did what any methodical man would do. I laid them all out, the whole archive, years of them. And I went through them with a loupe, comparing, because I wanted to know whether the wrong reflection had been there all along and I'd simply never looked closely, or whether it had appeared only that once. And the answer, which I have never been comfortable with, is that it was there before. Faintly. In a handful of the older frames, the ones taken in the last light at the turn of the season, the reflection is subtly off. Not as gross as that final evening, but off. A peak in the water that has no business there. A notch that doesn't match. I'd photographed the wrongness for years without seeing it. It had been showing me the other place, a little for a long time. On the right evenings, and I'd been too busy with my instruments and my readings to look at my own pictures closely enough to notice. The last evening wasn't the first time the lake reflected somewhere else. It was just the first time it did it boldly enough that I couldn't miss it. The first time it wanted me to see. It was late September, the tail end of the season. The first snow's not yet come, but the nights already hard with frost. I hiked in on a still, clear day, and the lake was doing its mirror trick, flawless, the reversed peaks lying in it sharp as glass. I made my camp, did the first half of my readings, and as evening came on, I sat at the edge of the water with my dinner and watched the light go off the high peaks, that alpenglow that turns the granite to rose and then to ash. And as the light failed and the surface of the lake went from mirror to black glass, I noticed something about the reflection that I could not account for, and that I have not been able to account for since. The reflection was wrong, not blurred, not disturbed. The water was dead calm. There wasn't a breath of wind. The surface was perfect. But the reflection of the peaks in the lake no longer matched the peaks. I want to be very careful here because it's a difficult thing to convey. Above the waterline were the real mountains. The skyline I knew intimately, every notch and spire of it. A skyline I had photographed and surveyed and could have drawn from memory. And below the waterline, in the reflection, was a different skyline. Reflected in that perfectly still water was a range of mountains that was not the range of mountains standing above it. The shapes were wrong. There were peaks in the reflection that had no counterpart above, and gaps in the reflection where real peaks stood, and the whole reverse profile was that of some other place entirely, some other set of mountains, lying upside down in the lake under the correct and familiar real ones. I did all the things a rational man does. I stood up, thinking it was a trick of my eye, of the failing light, of fatigue from the hike. The reflection held its wrong shape. I moved along the shore to change my angle, and it changed the way a real reflection changes with your position, parallax and all, except it remained the reflection of mountains that weren't there. I took out my camera, an actual film camera, this was years ago, and I photographed it, several frames, the real skyline, and its impossible reflection in one shot. And then the dark came down in earnest, and the surface went to pure black, and there was nothing more to see. And I went to my tent, and I did not sleep much, and in the morning the lake was an ordinary lake, reflecting the ordinary correct mountains, mirror perfect, exactly as it should be. I told myself, hiking out, that I'd imagined it, that the photographs would show the normal skyline, and I'd have a good laugh at myself. I had the film developed, I still have the prints, and in the prints, the reflection is wrong. It's subtle. You have to know the real skyline to see it, but it's there. The reversed peaks in the water do not match the peaks above them. And I have shown those photographs to exactly 2 people in 20 years, both of them knowledgeable about that country. And both of them went quiet and handed them back and changed the subject because there is nothing to say about them. They are photographs of a still lake reflecting a place that is not there. I should describe the rest of that night, the hours between seeing it and the dawn, because they were their own ordeal and they shaped what I came to believe. After the dark came down full and the surface went to that pure black, I went to my tent, as I said, but I did not sleep, and I lay there listening, and here's the thing. The lake made sounds that night it had never made. Not loud. A high lake at night is nearly silent. The faint lap of water, the wind if there is any, and there was none. But there was, all that night, a sound from the lake, very low, that I can only describe as the sound of a large volume of water moving slowly. A deep, slow shifting, as though something below the surface, something the size of the whole lake or larger, were turning over, very gradually, in its sleep. And I lay in my tent 50 feet from the water and listened to that slow, deep shifting all night, and did not once unzip the tent to look, because I had the certain knowledge that the wrong reflection I'd seen at dusk was the face of whatever was making that sound, that the other range of mountains lying in the water was the back or the shoulder of something that filled that basin from below. And that if I looked out at the black water in the dark, I might see the surface bulging with the slow movement of it. And that this was precisely the thing the dusk had warned me not to look at more closely. So I lay still and listened to the lake breathe all night. And at first light, the sound was gone, and the water was a normal lake again. And I packed and hiked out faster than I have ever hiked anywhere. I never went back. I arranged for the monitoring station to be serviced by others, citing my age and the difficulty of the hike, which was true enough that no one questioned it. And I've spent 20 years, not as a haunted man exactly. I sleep fine. I've had a good life. But as a man with a single fixed splinter in his understanding of the world that will not work itself out. Because here's what troubles me, as a man who has studied water his whole life. A reflection is not a picture. A reflection is the light from the real thing, bent off the surface of the water into your eye. For the reflection of those mountains to be wrong, while the mountains themselves were right, the light coming up out of that lake would have had to be light from somewhere else, from some other range, some other place, lying somehow beneath or behind or inside that cold, deep water, sending its image up to lie reversed under the skin of the world I knew. I don't have a mechanism for that. There is no mechanism for that. Water reflects what's above it. That's all it does. That's all it can do. Except for one evening at the end of one season, that one lake reflected something else. And I've come to think, in my old age, that the still water in those high, cold places is thinner than we know. That it's a kind of surface between. And that most of the time, nearly all of the time, it shows you only your own world, the peaks above, the right way up reversed. But that now and again, at the turn of the season, in the last light, it forgets to, or chooses not to, and shows you the place on the other side of itself instead. I don't know what that place is. I had the strong sense sitting there at the shore in the dark that I did not want to see it more clearly, and that if I had stayed at the waterline staring into it long enough to make out the details of that other range, something about the staring would have been an answer to a question, and that I would not have liked being asked. I'll add one thing, because it's the only outside corroboration I ever got, and it changed how I hold the whole matter. Years after, near the end of my career, I mentioned the lake carefully to an older colleague, a man who'd surveyed the high country for the geological side his whole life, and who I trusted. I didn't tell him what I'd seen. I just asked, in a roundabout way, whether he'd ever come across anything he couldn't account for, up at altitude, around the still tarns. And he looked at me a long moment, the way men of that generation did when they were deciding whether to say a thing. And then he told me that there were a handful of those high lakes. He could name them, that the old surveyors had marked in their private way, not on any official map, as lakes you didn't camp at, didn't linger at, didn't look too long into. He said the reason given, when any was given, was always vague. Bad air, sudden weather, the usual cover for things men don't want to say plainly. But he said the real reason, the one passed quietly from one old surveyor to the next, was the reflections. He said those particular lakes, on certain still evenings, didn't reflect true, and that a man who studied a wrong reflection too long was apt to come down off the mountain not quite right, and that the rule was you took your readings and you moved on and you did not make camp at the mirror lakes. And he asked me plainly, which lake? And when I told him, he nodded, slow, and he said, that's one of them. It was on the old list. Somebody should have told you, and that was all. But it was enough. It meant I hadn't imagined it, that the wrongness in that water was known, had been known for a long time, known well enough to be a rule among careful men, and that I'd simply never been told, because the knowing was dying out, the way it does, as the old ones retire and the lists in their heads go with them. That's the whole of it. I've no moral to give you, no warning even, because I don't know what the warning would be. Don't look too long into Stillwater in the high country, I suppose. It's thin up there, more than the air. Story 4. My family has run cattle in the same stretch of foothill country for 4 generations. Oak savanna up in the gold country, the rolling hills with the big valley oaks, and the dry yellow grass that everybody who isn't from here thinks looks dead but is just California being California. I grew up on that ranch. I'll likely die on it. And I've spent my whole life out in those hills at all hours, calving, fixing fence, chasing strays, and I know them better than I know just about anything, which is why the thing I'm going to tell you bothers me the way it does, because it happened on ground I know better than the back of my hand. We've got a particular hill on the property, the back of the place, that the family has always called the Bald, because the top of it is bare of trees, just grass, and the rest of the hills around it are dotted with oaks. And there's an old story about it, the kind of thing my grandfather would say and my father would roll his eyes at. That you don't graze cattle on the Bald overnight, and you don't let yourself get caught up there after dark. My grandfather never explained it past that. It was just one of his rules, like don't whistle in the barn, and don't turn a horse out in the north section in fog. And most of his rules had some practical reason buried in them somewhere, even if he didn't say it. So nobody thought much about the Bald. We just didn't run cattle up there overnight. And that was that. It wasn't good grazing anyway. Before I get to that night, I want to tell you one thing about my grandfather, because it stuck with me. When I was a boy, maybe 10, I asked him once, point blank, the way kids do, why we couldn't graze the Bald overnight. What was the big deal? It was just a hill. And he didn't get annoyed, and he didn't brush me off the way he did with most questions. He set down what he was doing, and he looked at me a long time, and then he said something I didn't understand then, and have spent my life understanding since. He said there's ground in this world that's ours and ground that's just letting us stay. And the Bald is the second kind. And the only rent it asks is that we leave it be after dark. And that's the cheapest rent you'll ever pay. So pay it and don't ask why. And then he went back to his work. And I remember being unsatisfied, the way a kid is, wanting the monster, wanting the real answer. It was only after my own night up there, and my father's telling, that I understood my grandfather had given me the whole truth in those few words. That he just declined to put the pictures in my head, because the pictures don't help a boy. The rule helps a boy, and he was a man who gave you what helped, and kept the rest. Ground that's just letting us stay. 4 generations on this place, and I've never heard it put better. I want to tell you about the night I broke the rule, not on purpose, and what I saw. And then I want to tell you the thing my father told me after, which is really why I'm writing. because the thing my father told me is worse than what I saw. I was out late looking for a heifer that had gotten through a fence. This was maybe 15 years ago. I was a younger man, and I'd tracked her up toward the back of the property as the light was going, and like a fool, I kept after her past dark because I could hear her, and I figured I'd have her in 5 more minutes. And 5 more minutes turned into me being up near the bald in full dark with a flashlight, which I knew better than to be, but cattle make you stupid sometimes. And I came up over a rise, and the bald was in front of me, the bare top of it, and there was enough moon that I could see the whole dome of it pale against the sky. The dry grass almost glowing the way it does under a moon. And there were people on it, standing on the top of the bald, a lot of them. My first thought was trespassers, partiers. Kids come onto the property to drink, which happens, and I was already getting angry about it as I came up the rise, ready to run them off. But something stopped me before I yelled, and it was the way they were standing. They were all standing still, spread out across the top of the bald, dozens of them, more than dozens, standing evenly spaced apart, all of them facing the same direction, downhill, away from me, out toward the valley. Not moving, not talking, no fire, no lights, no music, none of the things you'd have with partiers. Just a crowd of still figures standing in the moonlight on the bare top of the hill, all facing the same way, silent. I turned my flashlight on them. I shouldn't have, but I did. I swept the beam across the top of the hill. And here's the thing, the beam didn't land on anybody. The light went right across the top of the bald and showed me nothing but grass. Empty grass, moving a little in the night breeze. And the second the flashlight beam passed, in the moonlight at the edges of the beam, the figures were still there, standing facing away. In the direct beam, nothing. In the moonlight, a silent crowd. I swept it back and forth a few times, my heart going up in my throat, and it was the same every time. The flashlight showed bare grass, and the moon showed a hillside full of standing people. And I understood, the way you understand things in your body before your mind catches up. That I was looking at something I was not supposed to be looking at. That the rule about the bald was exactly this. And that my grandfather had known. I did not go up onto the bald. The heifer, I'll tell you, was up there. I could see her now at the edge of the crowd, just standing among the figures, calm as anything. And every instinct I had as a rancher said, "Go get your animal." And every instinct I had as a living creature said, "Do not set foot on that hill," and the second one won. I left the heifer, I turned around and I walked back down the rise, not running because something told me not to run. Told me running would be like a rabbit bolting, would turn me into prey. So I walked slow and steady back down off the high ground with my back to all those silent standing figures, and that walk down was the longest walk of my life. Every step expecting to hear them start to move behind me. And I never did hear them move. There was no sound at all. And that was almost worse. The heifer came back on her own the next morning. Walked down to the barn lot at first light like nothing had happened. Fit and fine. I never told anybody what I'd seen that night for a long time, until finally I told my father years later when he was getting on and we were talking the way you do. And I told him about the bald and the standing people and the flashlight showing nothing. And my father didn't act surprised. That's the thing. He nodded slow and he was quiet a while. And then he told me what his father had told him, the reason for the rule, which his father had made him swear not to tell unless he had to, unless somebody'd seen them, because there was no sense putting it in a person's head otherwise. He said the bald is a gathering place, that it was a gathering place long before our family ever ran a cow on that ground, long before there was a ranch, long before any of the people who are here now were here. He said the ones who gather there are the people who used to live in this country, the first people, the ones who were here for thousands of years before anybody else came, and that the bald was a place that mattered to them, and that they still come on certain nights to stand on it and face the valley the way they always did. And he said they don't bother you and you don't bother them. That's the whole of the arrangement. You stay off the bald after dark and let them have it, and they let you have the rest. And the family's been keeping that arrangement 4 generations. And that's why we've never had trouble, real trouble, on this place, when other ranches around have. I want to put in here what my father looked like while he told me all that, because I've replayed it so many times that I've started to study his face in the memory. He's not a dramatic man, my father. He's a rancher, same as his father, same as mine will be if I have any say, which means he is quiet, practical, not given to stories or embellishment. And the way he looks when he's telling you something true is the same way he looks when he's telling you the price of hay, flat and direct and without ornament. And that's the face he had telling me this, the hay price face, which meant every word of it was the plain truth as he understood it. And he was not interested in what I did with it, only in getting it said now that it needed saying. And I realized, watching him, that he'd been carrying this his whole life, that his father had handed it to him, the same way, flat and direct. Here's the thing about the bald. Here's the arrangement. Here's what it costs a man to break it. And my father had carried it for 40 years, waiting for the day one of his children would come to him having seen the bald and needing to know. And he was relieved. I could see it. Relieved to hand it off, the way you're relieved to put down a thing you've been holding a long time. And I understood that this is also what the ledger entries were. My great-great-grandfather's terse lines, they were the same relief, the same putting down, the same need to hand the weight of knowing to whoever came next. So you didn't have to carry it alone anymore. And now I carry it. And someday I'll hand it to whoever of my own comes to me having seen the bald, hay-price face, flat and direct. Here's the arrangement. Here is what it costs. That's how it works. That's how it's always worked on this ground. One generation to the next. The same weight, the same plain words, the same relief of not being the last one who knows. And then my father said the thing I really called to tell you. He said the danger is in that they'll hurt you. He said they won't. They've got no interest in you. You're not even really there to them. You're like a draft, like weather. He said the danger is that if you go up and stand among them, if you let yourself be drawn up onto the bald and you take your place in that crowd and you face the valley the way they're facing it, you start to see what they're looking at. And he said his father told him that a man had done that once, generations back, had gone up onto the bald in one of those nights and stood among them and looked where they looked, and had come down off the hill in the morning, and had lived another 40 years, and had never once in those 40 years been able to take any joy in a single thing. Because once you've seen the valley, the way they see it, the way it was and the way it's going to be, all of it at once, you can't unsee it. And then now that the rest of us live, it just looks like a thin little slice of a thing you've seen the whole of. And there's no living happily in a slice once you've seen the whole. There's one more piece, and it's the piece that turned this from a story I'd seen into a thing I understood. After my father told me all that, I went looking because that's my nature, and there's an old ledger book my great-great-grandfather kept when he first homesteaded the place. Just accounts mostly, cattle bought and sold, weather, the dry years and the wet ones, the dull bookkeeping of a working ranch 100 and some years back. And I'd looked through it before for the family history, but never with this in mind. And reading it again, looking for the bald, I found the entries. They're not dramatic. That's what makes them land. Just here and there, across the years, in that old, careful hand, a line. Cattle off the bald by dark, every entry through one whole fall. And once the line that stopped me cold, the only time he ever wrote anything close to plain about it. Hired man went up the bald on a clear night against my warning. Will not say what he saw. Has give his notice. Pray God he finds his peace. And then nothing more. The accounts just go on. Cattle and weather. Like the old man had said the only thing he was ever going to say about it and close the book on it. So it's not just my father's story. And it's not just the one night I saw it. It goes back to the first of us on that ground. The keeping of the rule, The cattle off the bald by dark. The men who broke it and gave their notice and went looking for a piece they'd traded away for one look off the top of that hill. 4 generations of us, more, keeping an arrangement my great-great-grandfather must have figured out the hard way his first fall on the place, and writing it down just enough that those of us who came after would keep it without having to learn it the way he did. And I've added my own line to the back of that ledger now, in my own hand, for whoever runs this place after me. Stay off the bald after dark. The rule is the rule. You don't need to know more than that, and I pray to God you never do. So I stay off the bald. We all do. And the heifer can fend for herself up there. If she's fool enough to wander up, she always comes back. I'm grateful I never set foot on that hill that night. Not because I'd have been hurt, because I'd have looked where they were looking, and I've got a good life down here in the slice. A wife and kids and grandkids coming, and I'd like to keep being able to enjoy it. Thanks all the same. Story 5, throwaway account, and I'd appreciate you not reading my email on air if you do use this, because I still work in the parks, and I'd never hear the end of it. I've been a seasonal and then permanent interpretive ranger for a long time, and I've worked a lot of units, but the one this happened in was a desert park down in the southeast of the state, real Mojave country, and I'll leave it at that for the location. Here's a thing the public doesn't know about rangers. We have radio protocols, and one of the protocols in a lot of the desert and backcountry units is that you check in. You're out alone a lot, in country where a broken ankle is a death sentence, if nobody knows where you are. So you call in your location and your status at intervals, and dispatch logs it, and if you miss a check-in, they come looking. It's a good system. It saves lives, and it's relevant to what happened, because the whole thing happened over the radio. I should tell you what the desert is like at night, on those shifts, because it matters to how the thing worked. People think the desert at night is empty and silent, and it is not. It's alive in a way the day isn't. The day is too hot for anything to move. But at night, the kangaroo rats come out, and the snakes, and the kit foxes, and the owls. And there's a whole world of small sounds, scurrying and rustling, and the calls of things, and the wind, and the cooling rocks ticking as they shrink. And you're alone in it, in your truck, or out walking your sector, with your radio as the one thread connecting you to other people, to dispatch, to the other rangers scattered across a couple thousand square miles of dark. That radio is everything on those shifts. It's your company and your lifeline both. You come to know the voices on it, the way you'd know family, the particular way each ranger keys up, their rhythms, dispatches, steady voice anchoring all of it. And I think that's exactly what the thing understood, what it preyed on. That out there in all that dark, the radio is the realest thing you've got. The voices on it more real to you than empty country around you, and that if it could get onto the radio, get into that thread of trusted voices, it'd be inside the one thing you didn't think to doubt. I was working a night shift, which we did sometimes in the hot season because the days were lethal and a lot of the resource protection work, watching for poaching, for vandalism at the rock art sites, happened better at night. I was parked at an overlook, doing exactly that, watching with my radio on the seat. And a little after 2 in the morning, dispatch called for a check-in from one of the other rangers on that night. A guy I'll call T, who was working a different sector of the park, miles from me, out in a remote section near the old mines. T answered the check-in. Normal, gave his location, gave his status, code 4, which means everything's fine, no assistance needed. Dispatch acknowledged. Routine. I half listened the way you do, just keeping track of where everybody is. I want to say something here about T himself, the real one, because of how it affected him. And because it's the part that convinced me this wasn't some equipment glitch or somebody playing a prank on the radio. T was a steady man, an ex-military guy, the last person to spook. And after that night, he was different. Not broken, nothing dramatic, but different. He requested days only, like I'd later do. And the thing he said to me once, the only time we ever really talked about it, has stuck with me. He said the worst part wasn't the voice out by the mines asking for company. The worst part was hearing the first check-in played back. Later, the recording, dispatch logs, everything, and hearing his own voice, his exact voice, code 4, everything's fine, calm as anything. From a time and place where he knew for a fact he hadn't keyed his radio because he'd been sitting in a dead spot with no signal. He said hearing himself say something he never said in his own voice, perfectly, was the thing he couldn't get past, because it meant the thing didn't just sound like him in a general way. It had him. It had his exact voice and his exact radio manner down so well that even he, listening back, couldn't have told it wasn't him if he hadn't known where he'd really been. He said, "How do you trust your own voice after that?" And I didn't have an answer. And I still don't. Maybe 20 minutes later, dispatch called T again, which was odd because it wasn't time for another check-in. They'd just done one. And dispatch's voice was different, careful. They asked T to confirm his location, and T answered, gave his location again, same as before, sounded a little confused about why they were asking, and dispatch was quiet a second and then said, "Copy," and that was that. I keyed up dispatch on a private channel because now I was curious, and I asked what was going on with T. And the dispatcher, who I knew well, a sharp woman who'd worked that desk for years, said something I've never forgotten. She said real quiet, "I just got a check-in from T on the main channel." 10 seconds before I called him, same voice, same call sign, gave a different location, and then when I called him, he answered from where he said he was the first time. She said, "I've got T checking in from 2 different places, and I don't know which one is T." And then the radio did something I have spent years trying to explain to myself and can't. T came on the main channel again, unprompted. No one had called him, and he started talking. And it was T's voice exactly, but it was wrong. It was talking too much. T was a man of very few radio words. Everybody is. You keep it short. And this was T's voice going on. Conversational, saying things like, "It's real quiet out here tonight. Real quiet. You ever notice how quiet it gets out by the mines? I could use some company out here. Why doesn't somebody come out by the mines and keep me company?" And dispatch did not answer it, and I did not answer it. And the real T, or the one I decided to believe was the real T, the one at the first location, came on and said, "Who is that? Who's on my channel?" And the two of them, the two T voices, were on the radio at the same time. The calm, chatty one asking for company out by the mines, and the sharp, confused one demanding to know who was on his channel. And they were the same voice, the exact same voice. And I felt the hair come up on my arms in a 105-degree desert night. And here's the thing that took me the longest to sit with. Longer than the double check-in. Longer than the wrong voice by the mine. It's what happened in the gap. There's always a gap on a night shift late. The long, quiet hours between 2 and 4, when nothing moves, and the radio's still, and the desert is just the desert. No calls, no traffic. Everyone's settled at their positions. That night, before any of it started, I'd been in that gap, parked at my overlook, and I remember feeling it, the gap, the particular silence of the desert at 2 in the morning. And I remember thinking, the way you do when you're that alone, that the silence had a quality to it. Something almost expectant, like the quiet before a person in the same room speaks. I'd told myself it was fatigue. But after everything that followed, I've thought about that feeling a lot, that expectant quality. And I've come to think the thing was already there, already listening to the radio, already learning the voices, and that what I felt in the gap was the quality of being in the same room as something that was paying very close attention, that was almost ready, that was about to make its move, and that I sat in my truck at the overlook for those 2 quiet hours, essentially in the room with it, while it studied us all through the radio and waited for the moment to begin. I don't know if it takes time, if it needs to listen before it can copy. but the gap that night felt like a held breath. And I think the held breath was its. Dispatch took control. She was good. She told everyone to hold, and she raised the real T, the second one, by asking him a question only he would know the answer to. Something personal, the name of his dog or some such. And he answered it right. And the other voice, the chatty one out by the mines, went silent the second she did that. The second she found a way to tell the two of them apart, it just stopped, like it knew the trick was over. And she directed the real T to drive in, now, code 3, all the way back to the station. Do not stop. Do not investigate anything. Do not respond to any radio traffic that wasn't her by name. And she kept him talking the whole drive in, so there was no gap the other voice could climb into. He made it in fine. Shaken, but fine. And here's the part that's kept me up. When he got in and we pieced it together, the timeline didn't work. The very first check-in, the routine one at 2 a.m. that I'd half heard, the one that started it all. The real T said he never made it. He said his radio had been acting up, cutting out, and that right around 2, he'd been in a dead spot by the mines with no signal at all. It hadn't been able to check in and had been driving to get to high ground to call when dispatch started raising him about being in 2 places. Which means the first check-in, the calm code 4 one that sounded completely normal, the one dispatch logged and acknowledged, and that I heard with my own ears, was not him. It was the other one. The other one checked in first, sounding perfectly like T, perfectly routine, code 4, everything's fine, and got itself logged into the system as T. And if the real T's radio hadn't been cutting out, if he'd been able to make his actual check-in on time, there'd have been no overlap, no 2 places at once, no tell. Dispatch would have just had T checking in normally all night. And at some point, the chatty one would have asked somebody to come out by the mines and keep it company. And it would have sounded exactly like a tired ranger wanting a little company on a long shift. And somebody might have gone. There's something the dispatcher told me, weeks later, when we finally talked about it off the clock, that I've never been able to set down. She'd been working that desk a long time, like I said, and she told me that night by the mines wasn't the first time. She said every few years on the night shifts, she'd get it. A ranger checking in from 2 places. Or a check-in from somebody she knew for a fact was off duty and home asleep. Or a voice on the channel asking, always asking, for somebody to come out to some remote spot and keep it company. She said the old dispatchers had trained her on it when she started. Not officially, there's nothing official about it, but quietly. The way you pass down the things that aren't in any manual. They told her if you ever get a check-in that doesn't add up, you don't ignore it and you don't panic. You find a way to tell the 2 apart. You ask the question only the real one can answer, and the false one will go quiet the second it knows you've made it. And they told her the one rule that mattered most, the one she made me promise to keep when I told her I was transferring out, which was never send anyone toward the voice that asks for company. No matter how much it sounds like one of your own out there alone and lonesome on a long night. The real ones key up and say their location and their status, and they keep it short, because that's the training, that's the discipline. And the false one talks and wants and asks you to come. She said in all her years she'd never once let anybody be sent to it. And that was the whole of her job, really, underneath the official job, to be the one at the desk who knew, so that on the night it happened, there'd be somebody who wouldn't send a tired ranger out to the mines to keep a friendly voice company. She's retired now, too. I hope they trained whoever took her desk. I hope somebody told them, because the thing out there is patient, and it's still checking in. And one of these nights, it'll get itself logged as real on a shift where nobody at the desk knows to ask about the dog. I put in for a transfer to a coastal unit that fall. I still work for the parks, like I said, but I don't work the desert at night anymore, and I never will again. And I'll tell you the practice I've kept ever since, the thing I do that I can't fully justify, but won't stop doing. When I'm on the radio now, anywhere, and somebody answers, I find a way, some small way, to make sure it's them. A reference to something only they'd know. A question with a private answer. Just a little check. Because that thing out by the mines proved to me that a voice on a radio is just a voice on a radio. That the wire doesn't care who's really there. That something out in the dark learned how to be one of us on the air well enough to get itself logged in as real. And that the only thing that ever caught it, the only thing it couldn't fake, was a question about a man's dog that the thing didn't know the answer to. So I always ask, I always make sure. It's a small thing, it costs nothing. And once on a hot night by the mines, it was the whole difference. Story 6. Hello, I'm writing this in English, which is my third language, so please forgive the mistakes. My daughter has helped me to fix some, but the story is mine, and the way of telling it is mine. I came to this country many years ago, and I've worked many jobs, but for almost 20 years, I've done landscaping and tree work. And for a long time, the company I worked for did the big estates up in the hills above the coast. The very wealthy houses where the properties are large and go back into the canyons. And that is where this happened, in one of those canyons, on a property of a person so rich I never once saw them in 3 years of caring for their trees. These canyons, you must understand them. The houses are at the top, on the ridges with the views of the ocean, but the property goes down into the canyon behind, and the canyon is wild. It is chaparral and old oaks and sycamores along the dry creek at the bottom, and it is steep, and most of the rich people never go down into their own canyons. They only look across them from their windows, so when we did the work down in the canyons, clearing the brush for the fire, you understand, for fire safety, which is the law there, we were alone in a wild place that the owners themselves had maybe never walked in. It was good work. I liked being down in the canyons, away from the houses and the quiet, with the smell of the sage. On this property, there was a place in the canyon, down near the creek, where nothing grew. I want to describe it correctly. It was a circle, more or less a circle, maybe 10 meters across, of bare dirt. All around it, the canyon was thick with brush, the chamise, the buckwheat, the wild things that grow so thick you cannot walk through them. You must cut your way. But this circle was bare. Not burned, not cleared, just bare, as if nothing had ever grown there and nothing ever would. And in the center of the circle was a single oak, an old one, very large, very old, but dead, long dead, gray and hard, no leaves, no bark in places, just the bones of a great tree standing alone in a circle of bare ground in the middle of all that living brush. I will tell you that the first time I saw it, before anyone said anything to me about it, my body knew. This is hard to say in English, but I will try. In the village where I am from, the old people had a word for a place that is not right, a place where you do not go. And it was not a word for something evil exactly. It was a word for a place that belongs to something else, that is spoken for. And when I was a boy, the old people would point and use that word. And we would not go there, a certain tree, a certain bend in the river. And we never asked why, because the word was enough, and I had not thought of that word in many years. I had come to this country and become a city man, a working man. I had left the village far behind. But the first time I came around the brush and saw that circle, that bare ground, that dead tree, the old word came up in me from childhood all by itself, before the foreman said anything, and I knew, the way I had known as a boy at the bend in the river, that this was a place that was spoken for, that belonged to something else, and that I should clear around it and not go in. So when the foreman gave his rule, I was not surprised. I had already been told by the oldest part of myself, in a word from a village across the world. I think these places are everywhere, in every country, and that every people has the word for them. And that the only thing that changes is that some of us forget the word, and the ones who forget it are the ones who walk in. The foreman, the first day, he told me and the other men, do not work in the circle. Clear all around it, but do not go into the circle. Do not cut that dead tree. do not even step on the bare ground. And we asked why, and he said the owner's instruction is very specific. In the contract even. The dead oak is not to be touched, and the circle is not to be entered. And the owner pays very well, and so we do what the owner says, and we do not ask. And I thought, these rich people, they are strange about their trees. Maybe it is a special tree to them. Maybe someone is buried there. A dog, who knows. So we cleared all around it for 3 years and never went in, and I did not think much about it. But I will tell you what I noticed. Working near it those 3 years, the small things, because it is the small things that made me start to be afraid. The cold was the first thing, before even the birds. Those canyons get hot, very hot in the afternoon. The sun comes down into them, and the rock holds it, and there is no wind down at the bottom. And you sweat through your shirt by 10 in the morning. But near the circle it was cold. Not cool the way shade is cool. Cold, a real cold, that you walked into like walking into a different room, and the closer to the bare ground, the colder. And on the hottest days of summer, with the sweat running off all of us up the slope, a man working near the edge of the circle would feel the heat just stop, like a wall and the cold come off that bare ground, and it made no sense. There was no water there, no spring, no shade even. The dead tree had no leaves to shade anything. It was open to the sky. It should have been the hottest spot in the canyon, and it was the coldest. I asked the foreman about it once early on, and he just said, yes, it's cold there. Don't think about it. He went back to work, and I understood that he had noticed it years before me and had decided long ago not to think about it. And I tried to do the same. But you cannot fully not think about a cold that has no reason, working next to it day after day in the heat. The birds. The canyon was full of birds, always the scrub jays screaming, the little birds, the hawks above, but not over the circle. The birds did not fly over the circle. I watched this many times. A jay would fly along and come to the edge of the circle and turn, go around, never across. Even the hawks, riding the wind up out of the canyon, would come to that air above the circle and slide around it. At first I thought I was imagining, but I am a man who's outside all day every day for 20 years. I noticed the birds without trying, and I'm telling you the birds did not cross that ground. Not in the air, not on the ground. Never. And the sound. When you walked near the circle, the canyon got quieter. Not silent, but lower, as if someone had turned down the sound of the world a little. The wind in the brush, the insects, the far cars on the road up top, all of it got thinner near the circle and thinnest at the edge of the bare ground. And I never had the courage to step into the circle to find out if inside it there was no sound at all. But I believe there was no sound at all. I believe the circle was a quiet place in the way that a held breath is quiet. The thing that ended it for me happened in the 3rd year. We had a young man working with us, new from somewhere else, who did not know the canyon and did not take the foreman's rules seriously, the way young men do not take rules seriously. And one day at lunch, the rest of us up the slope in the shade eating, this young man, to show he was not afraid, to make a joke of it, walked down to the circle and stepped over the edge onto the bare ground and walked to the dead oak in the center and put his hand on it. Nothing happened. That is what I must tell you. Nothing happened, in the way you would expect. No sound, no lightning, he did not fall down. He stood there with his hand on the dead tree, and he laughed, and he called up to us, "See, it is nothing, you are all old women." And we yelled at him to come out of there. And he laughed at us and took his time, and then he came out and he ate his lunch, and the day went on. And I thought, well, maybe it is nothing, maybe we are foolish. But the young man was not right after. Slowly, over the next days and weeks, he changed. He became quiet. He who had been so loud, he stopped joking. He stopped eating with us. And he began to say a strange thing. He began to say that he could hear the tree. He said the dead oak in the circle was talking very quietly all the time, and that he could hear it even at home, even far from the canyon, even at night. A quiet talking always going, just below where he could understand the words. He said it followed him. He said he had brought it home with him from the circle, that when he put his hand on the tree, something had attached to him and come away with him and would not let go. We thought he was using drugs. We thought he was sick in the mind. The foreman let him go finally because he could not work. And I heard later from another man that the young man was not living anymore, that he had done something to himself to make the quiet talking stop. And I will not say more than that because it is a sad thing, and his family is a real family with real grief, and it is not mine to tell. Before I left, I asked the foreman about the circle, finally, directly, the way I never had in 3 years. He was an older man, had worked those hills longer than me, and after what happened to the young man, I think he was ready to talk, or maybe he just felt he owed me something. And he told me that the do not enter clause wasn't only on that one property. He said he'd worked these canyons for 30 years for many companies and many owners, and that there were other circles, other places on other properties, always with the same kind of instruction buried in the contract. Do not clear here, do not enter here. Leave this be. And that the oldest landscapers, the ones who'd been at it longest, all knew where they were, passed the knowledge along quietly to the new crews. This canyon has one down by the creek. That estate has one up in the Oaks. Stay out of them. He said nobody knew exactly what they were. Some of the men thought they were old native places, sacred ground from before any of the houses or the city or the rich people, and that the circles were where something had always been kept or kept out or kept sleeping. He said his own theory after 30 years was simpler and worse, that the circles were where these things lived, that they didn't move around much, that each one had its place and stayed in it, patient for who knows how long, and that the bare ground and the dead tree and the birds that wouldn't fly over were just what it looks like when one of them has been sitting in the same spot for longer than there's been a California. He said the rich owners who kept the rule in their contracts were the ones who'd learned somehow the hard way or from somebody who knew, and the ones who hadn't learned were the ones whose new houses you'd sometimes hear about, the ones with the troubles, the families that didn't last in them. And then he told me to forget the whole conversation and go home and not work the canyons anymore if it bothered me, which is exactly what I did. I left that company not long after. I told them my back was bad, which was a little true. The real reason is that I did not want to work in that canyon anymore, near that circle, after what happened to the young man, because I had understood something finally, that the foreman's rule was not about the rich owner being strange about a tree. The rich owner knew. Somewhere along the way, the owner of that land had learned what was in that circle and had put it into the contract. Do not touch the tree. Do not enter the circle. Not to protect the tree from us, but to protect us from the tree, and was willing to pay very well to have men who would keep the rule. And the only mistake was hiring one young man who did not believe in rules he could not see the reason for. I think about the young man. He put his hand on the dead tree for 10 seconds, laughing, to show he was brave, and the tree gave him something to carry that he carried for the rest of his short life. I do not know what the tree was, or the circle, or why the birds would not fly over it, or what the young man heard talking. I am a landscaper, not a priest, not a scientist. But I know that there are places in those wild canyons behind the rich houses where something old is waiting in a circle of bare ground, very patient, very quiet, asking nothing, doing nothing for years and years, until some young man who does not believe walks in and puts his hand on it. And then it is not patient anymore. Then it has what it wanted, and it goes home with him. Clear around the circle. Do not go in. The rule is the rule because of what happens when you break it. A quick word. Call to action 2 of 3. We're about halfway through tonight. If you've made it this far with me, do me a favor and leave a comment telling me which story has gotten under your skin the most, because I do read them. and it tells the algorithm this video is worth showing to more people. Comments and subscriptions are the whole game for a channel this size, okay? Let's keep going. Story 7. So, I don't really know how to do this, so I'm just gonna talk and you can cut it up. I commercial fish, or I did salmon and crab, mostly, out of a couple of the little ports up on the far north coast, the Lost Coast they call part of it, which if you've never been is about the most remote coastline left in the state. No highway can even hold to it. The mountains come right down into the sea, so steep they had to route the whole highway system way inland around it. It's wild up there, in a way people don't believe California can be. Fog half the year, nobody around, and the fishing grounds off that coast are where I spend a big chunk of my life and where this happened. I want to say up front, I'm not a superstitious guy, but that's a lie. Every fisherman is superstitious. The sea makes you that way. You don't whistle on a boat, and you don't bring a banana aboard, and you don't leave on a Friday, and 100 other things. You can laugh, but you keep the rules anyway because the ocean kills people who get cocky, and the rules are just respect. And that's all they are. Respect for a thing way bigger than you. So keep that in mind. We've got rules out there. And the biggest rule, the one nobody ever even had to say out loud, is about the fog. The fog up there isn't like other fog. It comes in thick. You've seen fogs, but this comes in so thick you can't see your own bow from the wheelhouse. You're running on radar and GPS and the sound of the water, and time in the fog gets strange and distance gets strange. And a lot of men have run up on the rocks in that fog, and that's the end of them. Because the water's so cold up there, you've got minutes, not hours. So you respect the fog. You slow down, you sound your horn, you pay attention. This was years back. I was out alone, which I shouldn't have been, but money was money and I had a small boat and the crew costs. And I was working pots and close to shore, and the fog came in fast the way it does. And I throttled down to dead slow and started working my way back out to deeper water to get clear of the rocks, sounding my horn, listening. And I'll tell you, being alone out there is the thing. It's the whole thing. Because I used to fish with my brother, the two of us, years. And after he went down, I couldn't bring myself to take on another deckhand. It felt wrong, like replacing him. So I started going out alone, which every fisherman will tell you is a fool's way to do it. The ocean's no place to be by yourself, but grief makes you do foolish things, and I did them. And so there I was, alone in the fog. The way I'd made myself alone ever since I lost him. And I think about that now, that the thing out there, whatever it is, it works on the alone ones, the way the desert one works on the alone ones, and the mountain one works on the alone ones. And I'd gone and made myself exactly that, a man alone, in the fog with nobody aboard, to say, hey, that horn's wrong, hey, you're steering us out to sea. Nobody to break the spell of it, just me and my grief and my own horn, calling me out into the deep. And I wonder sometimes if it could smell that on me, the aloneness, the grief, if that's why it picked me. If that's why a few weeks later, it knew to use my brother's voice. It knew I was a man who'd go alone into the fog after something he'd lost. I'd been telling the whole ocean that for 2 years, and I heard another horn answer mine. Now that's not strange by itself, other boats. You sound your horn so they know you're there. That's the whole point. So I sounded again, and it answered again, off my port side, out toward deep water. And I figured another boat working the same grounds, caught in the same fog, and I felt better, honestly. Company in the soup. And I worked toward it a little the way you do. You sort of keep track of each other by horns so nobody runs anybody down. And every time I sounded, it answered off the port bow, a little way ahead, leading out toward the deep. And I followed it because I wanted to get to deep water and away from the rocks anyway. And this other fellow seemed to know the way. I want to try to put you in that fog because if you've never been in it, you can't understand how it takes your judgment. It's not like fog on land, where you can still see the ground at your feet, still get your bearings. Out on the water in fog that thick, you lose everything. up and down almost. The gray is the same in every direction. The water and the air blend together. There's no horizon, no shore, no sky, just gray. And your own boat, the only solid thing in the world. And the only sounds are the ones you make and the slap of water you can't see. Your mind starts to fill the gray with things. Everybody who's been in it knows this. You start to see shapes that aren't there. Hear things. The fog is a screen your fear paints on. So when the horn started answering me, part of me was glad of it, the way you'd be glad of any real outside thing and all that gray nothing. A real other boat, real company, a fixed point. That's the trap, I think. The fog strips you down to where you're desperate for one real other thing, and then it gives you one, and you grab it and you follow it because the alternative is being alone in the gray. And being alone in the gray is its own kind of terror. It knew that too, whatever it was. It waited for the fog, when a man's most alone and most hungry for a voice. And then it gave me one. But something started to bother me, slow the way things do. The horn was wrong. Not the sound of it. The sound was a fine, ordinary boat horn. The timing. When you've got two boats sounding off in fog, there's a human rhythm to it. They sound back, but not instantly. There's a beat. A person hears your horn and reaches up and pulls their own. There's always that little human delay. And this horn answered too fast, right on top of mine, almost like an echo. And then I thought, well, maybe it is an echo. Off a cliff, the fog plays tricks. But you can't get an echo off open water leading you out to sea. An echo comes back at you from the hard thing it bounced off, from the shore, from behind me, not from out ahead in the deep, where there's nothing to bounce off of. And then I noticed the other thing, and this is the one that turned my blood, the one I can still feel in my chest telling it. My horn and the other horn had started to sound exactly alike. When the fog first came in, the other boat's horn had been a little different from mine. A little higher, a different boat's horn. They're all a little different. And the longer I followed it, the more it sounded like mine. Until it was mine. Until I was sounding my horn and hearing my own exact horn answer me from out ahead in the fog, leading me out to sea faster and faster. My own horn calling me out into the deep water away from the coast. And I realized I had been steering toward it for a good while. That I'd let it lead me. That I had no idea anymore how far out I was or which way the shore lay. That I'd been following the sound of my own horn out into the open ocean in the fog like a fool, like a man being walked off a cliff in the dark. I stopped. I took my hand off the horn and I did not sound it again, and the other horn sounded one more time, my horn, out ahead, and then waited, and then sounded again, like it was asking, like it was saying, "Come on, why did you stop? Come on, this way." And I sat dead in the water in the fog with my own horn calling me from the deep, and I did the only thing I could think of. I got on the radio, the actual radio, channel 16, and I called out, and a real voice answered. The Coast Guard, real and human and a little annoyed, and asked my position, and I gave him my last good GPS fix, and he told me I was way, way further out than I had any business being in that fog in a boat my size, miles out, and that there was no other vessel showing anywhere near me on anybody's radar or AIS, that I was alone out there, the only boat in all that water for miles. I ran in on instruments, slow, careful, ignoring the horn, which kept on for a while, and off the bow, my own horn, sounding and waiting, getting fainter as I went the other way, until the fog finally thinned near the coast, and it was gone, and I could see the dark shapes of the headlands, and I got myself in. The dock was empty when I tied up, middle of the night, and I sat in the boat a long time before I could make myself go up the gangway. And I'll tell you the thing about the fog that nobody tells you, the thing I only understood sitting there. By the time I'd stopped and called the Coast Guard and run home on instruments, the fog had been around me so long that solid ground felt wrong. The dock felt too still, too fixed, the whole world too steady. The fog had been the whole world for hours, and now the world was back, and it felt thin. It felt like a crust over something, and I had to sit there a long while before the ground felt real again, before the boat and the dock and the night sky felt more real than the gray and the horn out there in the deep. And I've thought about that since. That's part of what it does, that if it had gotten me much further out, much longer, the deep might have felt more real than the shore. Might have felt like home, and the shore like the strange place. And then the horn calling me out wouldn't have been a trick anymore. It would have just been pointing the right way. I think there are men out there who crossed that line, who got so far out that the fog became the world, and who don't come back, not because the cold got them, but because the shore stopped making sense, stopped pulling, and they just went on out, following their own sound, because by then it felt like the only honest direction left. There's a thing that happened after, before I sold the boat. That's the reason I sold the boat, and not just the fog night. A few weeks later, I was tied up at the dock one evening working on gear, just me. The other boat's empty. that quiet time after everybody's gone home. And I heard my name. From out on the water, past the breakwater, out in the dark. My name, called once in a voice. And here's the thing. It wasn't my own voice this time, the way the horn had been mine. It was my brother's voice. My brother who'd fished with me for years and who'd died at sea, gone over the side in weather years before, never recovered. Which is the thing you fear most out there, to go over and not be found, and it's how he went. And I heard his voice, his exact voice, calling my name from out past the breakwater in the dark, out on the water where he'd gone down. And God help me, I stood up. I stood up and I went to the rail, and I almost answered because it was my brother, it was his voice. And I had spent years not getting to say goodbye to him. And every part of me wanted to call back, to say, I'm here, where are you? I'm coming. And I had my mouth open. And the thing that stopped me, the only thing, was that I'd already learned the lesson. 3 weeks before, in the fog. It wears your sound. It learns the voice that'll get you to come. And 3 weeks before it had used my own voice, because that's all it had of me. But in 3 weeks, it had learned more. It had learned, somehow, the one voice in all the world I could not refuse, my dead brother calling me out onto the water where he drowned. And I understood, standing there with my mouth open, about to answer, that this was the same thing from the fog, that it had followed me into the dock, that it had studied me, that it had found the better hook. And I shut my mouth, and I did not answer. And I got off that boat, and I drove home shaking. And his voice called my name twice more from the dark water behind me as I went up the dock, my brother calling, and I did not turn around. That was the hardest thing I've ever done. Not turning around when my brother was calling my name, knowing it wasn't him, knowing the real him was years gone, and the thing using his voice was right there behind me on the water, patient, wanting me to come. I sold the boat that week. Not that year, that week. And I've told this to a few of the old fishermen up there over the years, the ones who have been at it the longest, and not one of them laughed at me. And that's how I knew it was real, because those are hard old men who'll laugh at anything. One of them, oldest of the bunch, he told me he'd heard his own horn in the fog once too, long ago, calling him out, and he'd had the sense I had, to stop. And he said the rule, the one nobody says out loud because you shouldn't have to, is that the fog out there isn't empty, that there's something in it that learns your sound, your horn, your engine, even your voice if you talk to it, and gives it back to you and uses it to walk you out into the deep, where the cold will do the rest. And that the only men who come back are the ones who realize the thing leading them is wearing their own sound and stop and don't follow. He said the deep wants company. He said it's lonely out there, and it learned a long time ago that the surest way to get a man to come to it is to sound just like him, because a man will follow himself anywhere. Story 8. I taught high school earth science for 31 years before I retired, and for most of those years I ran the astronomy club, which meant I took groups of teenagers out to dark places to look at the sky. And I got very good at it, at the logistics of it, at the night sky, at managing kids in the dark. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that I have spent more nights under the stars in the California desert and mountains than almost anyone, that I know the sky cold, that I can identify satellites and planes and iridium flares and weather balloons and Venus low on the horizon, fooling people into calling the police, all the things that people mistake for something stranger. I am, by temperament and training, a debunker. I have spent my life teaching kids to ask, what's the ordinary explanation first? So understand that I tried that night very hard to find the ordinary explanation, and that I'm writing to you because I never did. I'll add one piece about the chaperone, the parent who was awake with us, because it's the only follow-up I have, and it's stayed with me. He was a practical man, a contractor, I think, not a science person at all, just a dad who'd volunteered to drive and chaperone, and he'd been standing right there with us when the light came down. And in the years after, he was the one who couldn't let it go. He'd call me every so often out of the blue, and we'd talk around it. And he'd always circle back to the same thing. He'd say, "You're the science teacher. You tell me, what was it?" And I'd say, "I don't know." And he'd say, "But you have to know. You teach this." And I'd have to tell him again that not knowing was the honest answer, and he could not accept it. It ate at him in a way it didn't quite eat at me. And I came to understand the difference between us. I had spent my life learning to sit with not knowing. It was my whole discipline, the thing I taught. He had no practice at it. To him, the world was things that had explanations. You call somebody, you look it up, you figure it out. That's how a practical man's world works, and the light had put a hole in that world that he had no way to close, and he spent years worrying at the edges of the hole. Last I heard, he'd gotten deep into the online communities. The ones that have an explanation for everything, the elaborate ones. And I think he'd finally found a story to fill the hole. And I was glad for him in a way, and sad in a way. Because the stories those communities tell are mostly not true, but they do close the hole. Maybe a man needs the hole closed more than he needs it closed correctly. I never went that route. I kept my hole open. It's the more honest way to live. But it's the lonelier one, I'll grant that. We were out in the eastern Sierra, the high desert on the dry side of the mountains. A place I'd taken the club many times for the dark skies, which are among the best in the country. There were 8 students that trip, all juniors and seniors, good kids, and 2 parent chaperones, and me. We had a couple of telescopes set up, and we'd done a good night of observing, and it was getting late. Past midnight, and most of the kids were in their sleeping bags. But a few of us were still up, me and 3 of the students, and one of the parents, just looking up, talking quietly the way you do under a big sky, and one of the students, a sharp girl, headed for an astrophysics degree. And last I heard she got it. She said, "Mister, what's that star doing?" And she pointed, and I looked, and there was a star, an ordinary looking star, medium brightness, up fairly high in the southern sky. Nothing remarkable about it except that it was moving. Slowly, not falling, not a meteor, not the quick straight track of a satellite. It was wandering. It would drift one way, stop, drift back, stop, move up a little. All very slow, very smooth, the way nothing in the sky moves. Now I went straight to the ordinary explanations, out loud, teaching even then because that's what I do. I said it's a plane. We're seeing it head on. So it looks stationary and the drift is it maneuvering. But it had no blinking lights, no red and green, no strobe. Planes are lit up like Christmas, and this was a plain white point of light, a star. I said it's a satellite. They can appear to change direction near the horizon, but it was high up, not near the horizon. And satellites move in straight, steady lines and don't stop and reverse. I said it's a balloon catching the light, but it held too steady against the wind. And balloons don't make smooth, controlled stops and starts. I went through my whole list, the list I'd taught 1,000 kids, and not one item on it fit. And the girl, the sharp one, was going through the same list in her own head and reaching the same dead end. I could see it on her face in the starlight, and then it noticed us. I have to pause on the moment before that, because it's the moment I've replayed most. The 5 of us standing there, the sharp girl and the 2 other students and the 1 parent and me, all of us having independently run out of explanations, all of us looking up at this wandering light, and there was a silence among us, a particular silence that I recognized even then as something I'd never quite had in 31 years of teaching. Because here's the thing about being the teacher, the adult, the expert. You always have the answer, or you have the posture of having the answer. You're the one who explains that's the role. And the kids look to you, and you deliver. And even when you say, "I don't know," you say it from a position of being the one who decides what's known. And in that moment, looking up, I had nothing, and the kids knew I had nothing, and I knew they knew. And the usual structure of it, teacher and students, expert and learners, just dissolved. And we were 5 human beings of no rank at all standing on the dark earth, looking up at something none of us understood, equal in our not understanding, and there was a terrible intimacy in it. I have never felt closer to other people than in that silence before the light came down. The five of us made suddenly and completely equal by a thing none of us could name. And then it noticed us and came down, and the calm settled over us, and even that closeness got taken into the strangeness. I know how that sounds. I have no other way to say it. The light was wandering around its patch of sky, and then it stopped and it got brighter, noticeably brighter, as if it had turned to face us. As if what we'd been seeing was the edge of something, and now we were seeing the face of it. And it came down, toward us, smoothly, silently growing, and the whole group of us who were awake stood up. And the girl made a small sound, and the parent grabbed two of the kids by the shoulders. And that light came down out of the southern sky in total silence, and stopped, and hung over a low ridge maybe a mile from our camp. A mile, no more, close enough that it was no longer a point of light, but a shape, a glowing shape, hanging silent over the desert, and we could see the ground lit up pale underneath it. And here's the part I have never been able to fit into any framework, the part that I think about most. We stood there, the five of us who were awake, and we looked at it, and it, I'm certain, looked at us, and there was a span of time. I cannot tell you how long because my sense of time was completely gone, where nothing happened except that we regarded each other across a mile of desert dark. That thing in us, and I felt no fear. That's the thing. I should have been terrified. The kids should have been screaming, and instead, all five of us stood there in a kind of calm, a deep, unnatural calm, looking up at it, and I remember thinking, with the part of my mind that was still working, this calm is not mine. This calm is being put on me. I am being held still and quiet, the way you'd hold a frightened animal still, and the fact that I could tell the calm wasn't mine was the only frightening thing about the whole encounter, that something was reaching into my own head and turning my fear down like a dial. And then it left, not quickly. It rose straight up silent, gathering back into a point of light as it went higher, and it drifted back to about where it had been in the southern sky, and it sat there as an ordinary-looking star for a minute or two. And then it simply went out like a switch, and the sky was just the sky. The four kids who'd been asleep slept through all of it. The five of us who were awake stood there and then sort of came back to ourselves all at once, the calm lifting off us together. And the kids started talking fast and scared and excited, and the parent was shaking, and I, the teacher, the debunker, I had absolutely nothing to offer them. No explanation. Nothing on my list. I'd spent my life teaching them to find the ordinary answer, and I stood there in the dark, having seen something I had no ordinary answer for, in front of my students. And that was its own kind of vertigo. We talked about it on the drive home, and I made a decision then that I've kept. I told the kids the truth, which was that I didn't know what it was, that I'd ruled out everything I knew how to rule out, and that the honest scientific position was that we'd all observed something we couldn't explain, and that not being able to explain something doesn't mean you get to fill the gap with whatever story you like. It means you sit with the not knowing, honestly, which is the hardest thing science asks of a person. The sharp girl, the future astrophysicist, she got it. She said, "So we just have to be okay with not knowing what we saw?" And I said, "Yes, that's exactly it." And she's the one of all of them I'd most trust to have seen straight. And she saw what I saw. I went back to that spot one more time, years later, alone, an old man by then. And I want to tell you why and what happened, because it's the real end of it. I went back because I'd never been able to leave it alone. The not knowing, and because the sharp girl, my best student, the one who'd seen it with me and gone on to become an actual astrophysicist, had stayed in touch over the years, and she'd told me something that sent me back. She told me she'd quietly looked into it, the professional way, with access to data I'd never have, the records of what's tracked in the sky, military, civilian, all of it, for that night. that location, that time. And she told me there was nothing. No aircraft, no satellite pass, no balloon, no test, nothing logged anywhere in any database she could reach for that patch of sky that night. Which she said didn't prove anything, absence of evidence and all. She was rigorous to the end, but which meant that whatever we saw, it wasn't anything that announced itself to the systems that watched the sky. And that troubled her professionally in a way she didn't like to talk about, because her whole field rests on the sky being watched and known. So I went back to the same spot on the same date, alone, and I sat out under that same enormous sky, half hoping and half terrified. And I'll be honest with you, nothing came. I sat out all night and the sky was just the magnificent ordinary sky. The satellites in their straight lines, a couple of planes blinking their honest red and green, the slow wheel of the stars. And toward dawn, I felt something I hadn't expected, which was a kind of grief. And I sat with it and tried to understand it. And what I understood was this: I had wanted it to come back. After all those years of trying to explain it away, of teaching my students to find the ordinary answer, of being the debunker, some part of me had driven all the way back out to that spot as an old man hoping to be visited again, hoping to feel that impossible calm settle over me once more. And it shamed me a little, that hoping, because it meant the thing had left something in me that night. Besides fear, that whatever turned my fear down like a dial had turned something else up, some longing, some pull, and that I'd carried it quietly for years without admitting it. And that I was sitting out in the desert in my old age like a man waiting at a window for someone who isn't coming back. And that, more than the light itself, is the thing I'd warn people about, if I'm honest. Not that it'll frighten you, that it'll leave you wanting it, and that the wanting doesn't go away. I'm an old man now. I've made my peace with the not knowing mostly. But I'll tell you the thing that stays with me, the detail that I can't sand down. It wasn't the light or the silence or the way it moved. It was the calm. It was that when it came close, something turned down my fear, deliberately, gently from the outside. The way you'd soothe a creature you didn't want to bolt, because you only soothe the thing you're handling. You only keep something calm if you've got a reason to keep it calm. If its panic would be inconvenient to whatever you mean to do. And I've spent the rest of my life not letting myself finish that thought. The thought about why a thing would want a field of frightened humans to be calm, and what the calm was for, and what might have happened that night if it had wanted more from us than to be looked at for a while across the dark. Story 9. I worked the Channel Islands for a few seasons as a field assistant on a seabird study, which means I lived on one of the islands off the Santa Barbara coast for months at a stretch with a tiny crew, sometimes just 2 of us, doing population counts and banding and the unglamorous, endless work of field biology. The islands are a national park, and most of them you can't just go to. You need a reason and a permit. And that isolation is the whole point of why the science happens there. And also the whole point of the story, because there is nowhere in California more cut off than a small field camp on an island 20-some miles offshore, with the boat coming once every couple of weeks if the weather allows, and the weather often doesn't. The island I was on is mostly known for its sea caves and its wind. The wind is relentless. It shapes everything. The plants grow sideways. You lean into it walking. You learn to talk over it. And at night in the little plywood field cabin, it never stops. This constant pressure and moan against the walls. And you stop hearing it the way you stop hearing a refrigerator. It just becomes the texture of the silence. I'm telling you about the wind because the wind matters. The wind is how I knew. There were 2 of us that stretch, me and the lead researcher, a woman with more field seasons than I had years. Unflappable. The most grounded person I've ever worked with, and I want that on the record, because she's the other witness, and she's not the type to spook. We had a good rhythm. Up before dawn for the counts, work through the day, dinner, notes, early to bed, and the wind the whole time. About 3 weeks in, the boat schedule got blown out by a long stretch of bad weather, the kind where the channel turns to a washing machine, and no sane skipper makes the crossing. And we knew we were on our own for a while longer than planned, which was fine. We were provisioned for it, or it's part of the deal. But it does something to you, knowing the boat can't come. The isolation gets a different flavor. You're not just remote, you're unreachable, and some animal part of your brain knows it. I want to try to convey the isolation because it's the bed the whole thing grew in. There's no leaving when the weather's down. You can see the mainland on a clear day, the lights of the coast at night, this thin, glittering line on the horizon, towns and freeways and millions of people, close enough to see and utterly out of reach, 20-some miles of cold, violent water in between. And that's almost worse than not seeing it. To look across the channel at the whole lit-up world, going about its business, and know you cannot get there, that you're on a rock in the dark with one other person and whatever else is on the rock with you. The radio works sometimes when the weather let it, a sat phone for emergencies. But those are thin threads, and they make the isolation more vivid, not less, because they remind you how far the help is. And the nights are long out there in the off-season. The dark comes early and stays, and there's nothing to do once the day's work and notes are done, but lie in your bunk and listen to the wind and feel how alone you are, how small the cabin is, how big and old and dark the island is around it, and how the island was full of people once and isn't, and how you're sleeping in the middle of that emptiness, and you start lying there, to feel the emptiness as a kind of presence, to feel watched by all that absence, and you tell yourself, it's just the isolation playing tricks. And then one night the wind stops and you find out it wasn't. The first night it happened, I woke up because the wind had stopped. That's what woke me. Not a sound. The absence of the sound I'd stopped hearing. The way you'd wake if a machine you'd tuned out suddenly cut off. Dead silence in the cabin. And I lay there a second confused. And then I heard, in that silence, footsteps. Outside. On the gravel and hardpan around the cabin. Slow, even footsteps. Walking around the cabin, crunch, 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 unhurried all the way around and back again. My first thought was the researcher, that she'd gotten up for something, but I could hear her breathing in her bunk across the cabin, asleep. My second thought was there's a person on the island, which was almost more frightening than anything supernatural, because there shouldn't be. You'd know, the boat schedule, the permits. But people do land illegally, and a stranger on a cut-off island in the dark is a real and human danger. So I lay dead still and listened, and the footsteps kept on, slow circles around the cabin, and I noticed two things that took the human explanation away. The first was that the wind was still gone. The whole time the footsteps walked, there was no wind. The constant island wind that never stopped was simply switched off, and it had never once done that in 3 weeks. And I understood somehow that the silence and the footsteps were the same thing, that whatever was walking had brought the silence with it or was made of it. The second thing was the rhythm. The footsteps were too even. A person walking on uneven ground in the dark adjusts, stumbles a little, speeds and slows. These were metronomic, identical. Crunch, crunch, crunch. The exact same interval, the exact same weight, around and around like a recording, like something imitating the idea of walking without the body that would make it imperfect. I whispered the researcher's name. She was awake instantly, the way field people wake, all at once and alert, and I didn't have to explain. She was already listening, and I watched her face in the dark go still and careful. And she did something then that told me she knew more than she'd ever said. She reached over very slowly, and she turned off the small light we kept on at night. The little LED plunged us into full dark, and she put her hand on my arm, hard, which meant be quiet and don't move. And we lay there in the black, in the unnatural windless silence and listened to the even footsteps circle the cabin. They circled for a long time, and then they stopped at the door, and there was a silence that was different from the windless silence. A waiting silence, a silence with a tension in it. Something standing at the door of the cabin in the dark, and the researcher's hand was crushing my arm, and neither of us breathed. And I have never in my life wanted so badly to not be noticed. I made myself small. I made myself nothing. I thought as hard as I could about being not there. And I swear to you, I felt the attention at the door, considering the cabin, considering whether to do something, the way you feel someone reading over your shoulder. And then the wind came back. All at once, full force, the moan against the walls, the pressure, the whole island roar of it returning between 1 second and the next. And with it, the footsteps and the attention and the waiting were just gone. And we were two people lying in a plywood cabin in an ordinary windy island night. And I learned later why the researcher knew exactly what to do, why her hand had gone to the light so fast, why she'd known to make us small and silent. It was that earlier experience she'd mentioned on the other island years before. And she told me the rest of it that morning over coffee, quietly. The way you tell a thing once and then never again. She'd been alone that first time, a young researcher, and she had not known. And when the footsteps came and stopped at her door, she had done the natural thing, the human thing. She'd called out, "Who's there?" the way you would. And she said the moment she made the sound, the moment she answered, the attention at the door changed, sharpened, focused on her completely, and the door, which was latched, began slowly to open. And she said she did the only thing left. She went silent, total silence, and stopped and made herself nothing. Scrambled back from answering as fast as she could, unmade the sound she'd made, and that the door stopped halfway and stood open on the dark for what felt like forever. The attention pouring in through the gap, deciding, and then the wind came back, and it was gone, and the door was just a door standing open. She never answered one again. And that's what she taught me without ever quite saying it as a lesson. That the circling and the waiting at the door are not the danger. The danger is answering. The danger is making the sound that says, "Yes, I'm here, I hear you," because that is the thing it's waiting for. That is the only thing that turns its attention from idle to focused. And that the silence isn't hiding exactly, it's declining. It's refusing to say the word that lets it in. We did not sleep. When the dawn came, we went out and looked. Of course we did, and there were no footprints. But the ground was hard pan and gravel and wouldn't have taken a print from a boot anyway. So that proved nothing either way, and I think we were both glad it proved nothing, because a clear boot print would have meant a human intruder, which was its own nightmare. And no print meant we could each privately keep telling ourselves we'd dreamed it. Except we hadn't, because we'd both been awake and we both knew it. The researcher and I talked about it exactly once, briefly that morning over coffee, and she said something I've held on to. She said she'd had something like it happen once before, years earlier on a different island, and that she'd asked an old-timer about it, a man who'd worked the islands for decades, and that he'd told her the islands remember being places where a lot of people lived for thousands of years, whole communities, before the diseases and the missions emptied them out, that these islands were full of people once and then weren't suddenly, terribly, and that on the still nights, the windless nights, which the old-timer said were the rarest and the wrong nights, something walks the old village sites and the field camps that sit on or near them, checking. The way you'd walk the rooms of a house where your family used to be, and that you do not answer it and you do not open the door. You just stay small and quiet and wait for the wind to come back and take it away. There's a thing I didn't tell you yet, because I wanted you to hear the nights first. The cabin we stayed in The field camp was built right on the edge of an old site. I didn't know that at first, but partway through the season, doing my survey work, I kept turning up shell. Midden, it's called. The layered remains of where people lived and ate for generations, broken shell and bone and dark earth. And once you know what you're looking at, you see it's everywhere around that camp. That the camp was built right in the middle of a place where people had lived for thousands of years. A village, a real one, occupied longer than anywhere in Europe you could name, and then emptied. And I mentioned it to the researcher, and she got a strange look and said yes. She knew most of the field camps on the islands are on or near the old sites, because the old people chose the good spots, the flat sheltered places near water, the same spots that are good to put a cabin. And so the science camps sit right on top of the villages, sleeping where they slept. And most people never think about it. And after she told me that, the footsteps made a different kind of sense, and a worse one. Because if the wind stopping meant something arrived and walked, and if we were sleeping in the middle of a place where a whole community had lived, and then suddenly, terribly, wasn't, then what walked around that cabin in the windless dark wasn't coming to us from somewhere else. It was already there. It was home. We were the ones who'd arrived, who'd built a plywood box in the middle of its village and gone to sleep in it. And on the still nights it came and walked around the strange object, full of strangers that had appeared in the middle of where it lived. The way you'd walk around something that didn't belong in your house, checking it, considering it, and the only reason it never did more than walk and wait at the door was, I think, that we had the sense the researcher's old-timer had taught her to go small and dark and quiet, to not answer, to make ourselves into something not worth the trouble, a draft, a nothing, until the wind came back. We were the intruders. That's the part I sat with for years after. We always tell it like something came to us in the night, but we'd moved into its home, and it was only ever checking on what we were. And we were lucky every time that it decided we weren't worth waking all the way up for. We finished the season. The boat came when the weather finally broke. It happened twice more before we left. The windless silence and the even footsteps circling, always deep in the night, and both times we did the same thing. Killed the light, stayed small, said nothing, waited for the wind. And both times the wind came back and it left. I've never been back to the islands. I left field biology not long after for reasons that were mostly practical and a little bit this. And I think about it on windy nights, here on the mainland, where the wind is just wind. I think about how the one thing I learned to be afraid of out there wasn't a sound, it was a silence. It was the wind stopping. Because on those islands, the wind stopping meant something had arrived. It was about to start walking, and all you could do was wait, small and dark and quiet, for the world to start breathing again. Story 10. All right. I've been lurking and listening to your channel for like a year, and I finally decided to send mine, because I heard one a while back that was kind of similar, and it made me feel less crazy. I drive for a rideshare, have for a few years, mostly nights because that's when the money is, and mostly in and around one of the big inland cities, the kind that sprawls out forever into the dark with the foothills behind it. And most nights are boring, drunk people, airport runs, the same conversations. This was not a boring night. So it's late, like 2:30 a.m., bar closes over. I'm thinking about logging off, and I get a ping. And the pickup pin is way out, like at the edge of the city where it starts turning into the foothills. The dark part where the streetlights give out and it's just these winding roads up into the hills with houses spread far apart. And I almost don't take it because it's so far out and probably no return fare from up there. But it's a long ride, which means decent money, so I take it. And look, before this happened, I was the guy who rolled his eyes at all this stuff. I listened to your channel and channels like it as entertainment, like spooky background noise. I never believed a word of any of it. I figured everybody was exaggerating or lying or had fallen asleep at the wheel and dreamed it. I'd driven nights for years, thousands of fares. I'd driven every weird drunk and every 3 a.m. sketchy pickup and every empty road in those hills, and nothing had ever happened to me. And I'd kind of decided nothing ever would, that the people this stuff happens to were a certain type, and I wasn't it. I'm telling you this because I want you to know where I started, so you know how far this thing moved me. Because the guy who got that ping at 2:30 in the morning did not believe in anything. And the guy who drove down out of those hills an hour and a half later believes in something now. Doesn't know what, but something. And can't go back to not believing. And honestly, that's its own kind of loss. The not believing, it was comfortable. I miss it. And the whole drive out there, my GPS is acting weird. Like it keeps recalculating, keeps losing the road, saying turn where there's no turn. And I've driven these hills before and never had that. But whatever, GPS does that sometimes in the canyons. And I get up to the pin and it's just nothing. It's a bend in the road. No house, no driveway, no person, just dark road and the hillside going up on one side and dropping off on the other. And I sit there with my hazards on, figuring it's a bad pin. Somebody set their pickup wrong. It happens. And I'm about to text the rider when the back door opens and somebody gets in. I didn't see them walk up. That's the first thing. I'm looking right at the road. My interior light didn't even come on the way it does when a door opens. And suddenly the back door is shut and there's a person in my back seat. And I startle. I actually jump. And I look in the mirror and it's a woman, older, maybe 60s, dressed kind of nice but old-fashioned nice. And she's just sitting there looking out the window, calm, like she's been in the car the whole time. And I do the thing you do. I confirm the name on the ride, and she doesn't answer the name. She just says, in this calm, flat voice, take me home. And I say, okay, is the address in the app, right? And she says, take me home the same way. And I figure, okay, she's maybe got some dementia or she's had a stroke or something. Older lady out at 2:30 a.m. alone in the hills. This is a vulnerable person situation, and I just want to get her somewhere safe. So I pull up the destination in the app, and it's an address back down in the city in an older neighborhood. Fine. And I start driving. And here's a detail I keep coming back to. The whole drive down out of the hills, before it got bad, I had the radio on, low, just background. And at some point I noticed she was humming. The woman in the back, humming along to whatever was on, real soft. And it gave me this little flush of relief, actually, because humming along to the radio is such a normal human thing, a sweet thing even. An older lady humming in the back of your car. And I thought, okay, she's okay. She's just a confused old lady and I'm getting her home. Except, when I actually listened, she wasn't humming the song on the radio. She was humming something else, something old, a tune I didn't know, slow, and it didn't match what was playing at all. And I turned the radio down a little to hear, and the second I did, she stopped, and the car was silent. And when I turned it back up, she started again, the same old tune that didn't match. And I realized she wasn't humming along to my radio at all. She was humming her own song. From somewhere, from some other time, and it had just happened to sound for a second like company. I turned the radio off after that. I couldn't stand the two sounds in the car at once, my station and her old tune underneath it, and not matching. In the drive down, she doesn't say anything else. I keep glancing at her in the mirror, and she's just looking out the window, calm, watching the dark go by. And I try to make a little conversation, you out late, everything okay? And she doesn't respond at all, like I'm not there, and I get this creeping feeling, but I tell myself, she's just not all there, poor thing. Get her home. And here's where it gets bad. As we come down out of the hills into the city, into that older neighborhood, she starts giving directions, but not with the app. She just starts saying, turn here, left at the next one. And her voice is different now, more certain, and the directions don't match the app. The app wants me to go one way and she's telling me another, and I follow her because what am I gonna do? And the streets she's taking me down are old, like old California. These little houses from the 30s and 40s, big old pepper trees, and fewer lights on. And it's getting to feel less like a neighborhood and more like a place that used to be a neighborhood. And I want to describe the feeling of those last few blocks because it's the part that wasn't scary exactly. It was sad, this deep sadness that filled the car, like driving into a held breath, like the streets themselves were grieving. And the woman in the back had gone very quiet and very intent, leaning forward a little, watching for landmarks, the way you do coming home after a long time away. This is the corner. The store used to be there, almost there now. And I realized she was navigating by a map that didn't exist anymore. That in her head, all of the houses were still standing and the lights were all on, and her home was waiting at the end of these blocks. And she was guiding me through a neighborhood that only existed now in her. And I was the only one who could drive her into it. And we were both about to find out together that it was gone. And she says, "Stop here." And we're in front of a lot, an empty lot. Weeds, a chain link fence, a foundation maybe, like a house that burned down or got torn down a long time ago and nobody ever built on it. And she's looking at it through the window and her face in the mirror has changed. It's gone. I don't know how to say it. It's gone slack and sad and far away. And she says, very quietly, "This isn't right. They said this would be home." And I say, "Ma'am, there's no house here. Is there somewhere else I can take you?" And she turns and looks at me. And for the first time, she looks right at me in the mirror, right into my eyes in the mirror. And her eyes are wrong. And she says, "You can see me." Just that, you can see me. Like it surprised her. Like it was the first time all night anybody had. And then she's not in the car. No door, no light, no nothing. I'm looking right at her in the mirror, and then the back seat is empty. And I'm parked in front of an empty lot at 3 in the morning in a part of town I don't know, with my heart going so hard I can hear it. And the app, the ride, it's just gone too, like it canceled itself, no record of it. And later I checked and there was no fare, no rider, no trip logged for that whole time. Like the hour and a half I'd spent driving her never happened in the system at all. I sat there a while, and then I did something, I don't know why. I got out and I looked at the lot, and there was one of those little historical markers, the metal kind the city puts up. On the fence, faded, and I read it with my phone light, and it was about how that block had been a neighborhood that got cleared decades ago. Eminent domain for a freeway that ended up getting routed somewhere else. So they tore down all the houses and displaced everybody, and then never even built the thing. And the lots just sat empty ever since. They tore down people's homes and moved them out. And the homes were never replaced and the freeway never came. They said this would be home. This isn't right. And here's the thing that made me actually quit nights. Because seeing her once I could have maybe lived with. Told myself it was a weird dream, sleep deprivation, whatever. It's that I started hearing about it from other drivers, once I knew to listen for it. I'm in a few of the driver groups, the chats, where people swap stories about weird fares and bad neighborhoods and which areas to avoid. And once this happened to me, I started paying attention, and they're in there. Not a lot, but they're in there, scattered through years of chat. Drivers talking about a fare out in those same hills, late. An older person gets in without you seeing them walk up, wants to go home, gives you directions that don't match the app, takes you to an empty lot and is gone. And every single one describes the same thing. The directions through the old, torn down neighborhood, the empty lot, the marker on the fence. And a couple of them, the detail that finished me. A couple of them described not an older woman, but an older man or a younger person, different people, different riders, all wanting to go home to the same cleared block, all gone at the empty lot. So it's not one ghost, and that's what I finally understood. It's not one lost woman trying to get home. It's all of them. It's everybody who got moved out when they tore down that neighborhood for a freeway that never came. A whole community displaced and scattered and dead now. And on the bad nights they come up into those hills. I don't know why the hills, maybe that's where they got moved to. Maybe that's just where the edge of the world is for them. And they get into our cars and they ask us to take them home. All of them, one at a time, year after year. And every one of us drives them down to the same empty lot and watches the same thing happen. The same slow understanding across the same different faces. This isn't right. They said this would be home. And most of the drivers never see them, just feel the cold and find a canceled ride in their app and a chill they can't explain. And a few of us, for whatever reason, can see them and have to be the one in the car when they remember that home isn't there anymore. I don't drive the hills at night anymore. I turn down the night work. I do days now, less money. I don't care. And I think about her all the time. That older woman who got in my car without opening the door, who wanted to go home to a house that got torn down before I was probably even born, who was so surprised that I could see her. And the thing that gets me, the thing I can't shake, is that last part. You can see me. Like she'd been trying to get home for a very long time, getting into people's cars in the dark hills, asking to be taken home. And nobody had ever been able to see her or hear her until me. And I think about all the drivers before me who maybe drove an empty back seat down out of those hills and felt a chill and never knew they had a passenger. And I think about the fact that for whatever reason, that one night, I could, and I wish to God I hadn't been able to because I couldn't help her. There's no home to take her to. It isn't there anymore. And now I'm just one more person who couldn't get her home. Except I'm the one who had to see her face when she figured that out. Story 11. I'll be brief and plain because that's how I am and because the plainness is the point. I spent my career as a structural engineer, bridges mostly, and I retired to a small place in the mountains. The southern Sierra, up at altitude, to get away from the city and the noise and to do the hiking I'd put off for 40 years. I tell you my profession because it explains how I think. I think in loads and forces and failure modes. I do not think in ghosts. When something doesn't make sense to me, my reflex is that I've measured wrong. Not that the laws of the world have bent. So the thing I'm about to describe has been a genuine problem for me. The way a bridge that shouldn't stand but does would be a problem, an affront to how I understand things to work. There's a trail near my place that I walk nearly every morning, a loop, about 5 miles, up through the pines to a granite dome with a view and back down. I walked it in every season, in snow with traction on my boots, in the heat, hundreds of times, probably 1,000 times over the years. I knew every root and rock on it. And about a third of the way up, the trail passes a rock fall, an old one. A jumble of granite boulders the size of cars and houses that came down off the slope above sometime long ago. And the trail threads through the lower edge of it, and among the boulders there's a gap, a dark space between two big rocks that you pass right by. A sort of low cave mouth, nothing dramatic. Just a shadow between stones that the trail goes past at about arm's length. For years I walked past that gap without a thought. I should mention that my wife walked that loop with me in the early years up here, before her knees gave out, and she took to staying home with her coffee and her books while I did the morning loop alone. And I've thought about this since, that in all the years she walked it with me, she never once remarked on the gap, never slowed at it, never felt a thing, and I never felt a thing either while she was with me. It was only after she stopped coming, only on the mornings I was alone, that it started. I don't know what to make of that, except that whatever's in the gap, it watches for the ones who come alone. Two people walking and talking, it lets pass without a glance. The way you wouldn't bother a couple deep in their own conversation. But a man alone, in the habit of being alone, comfortable in it, even fond of it, the way I'd become, that's the one it watches. That's the one it eventually asks. I've wondered in my darker moods whether all those years of loving my solitary morning walk, of preferring it alone, of being a little relieved when my wife's knees kept her home. Whether that was me making myself into exactly the kind of creature it asks. The one who comes alone and likes it and might say yes. And then one morning, and I cannot tell you why this morning and not the 1,000 mornings before, I walked past it and I had the absolute conviction that something in the gap was watching me. Not a feeling, not a mood. A conviction as solid as my conviction that the ground was under my feet. Something was in the dark of that gap, and it was watching me walk by. And it had, the thought arrived fully formed, always been there, and I had simply never noticed before. The way you can drive a road for years and never see a building and then see it and never be able to unsee it again. I did the rational thing. I stopped and I looked into the gap, and it was just a dark space between rocks. Going back a few feet, nothing in it, no animal, no eyes, nothing. And I told myself I was an old man whose mind had wandered, and I walked on. But the conviction didn't lift. It got stronger as I walked away. The sense of being watched from behind, from the gap. And I'll admit I walked a little faster and felt foolish for it. And here's the thing that made it a problem, the engineer's problem, the thing I can't resolve. After that morning, it was there every time. Every single time I passed the gap, in either direction, going up or coming down, the conviction landed on me the moment I came in sight of it, and lifted the moment I was past, like passing through a beam, like crossing a line on the ground. Reliable, repeatable. And anything reliable and repeatable, to my mind, is real, is a phenomenon, is data, because the one thing my whole career taught me is that randomness is random, and patterns have causes. A feeling that comes and goes at random is a mood. A feeling that switches on at exactly the same point on a trail every single time. In all weather and all moods, regardless of whether I'm thinking about it or have forgotten about it entirely until it hits. That is not a mood. That is a measurement. Something was at that gap, and my passing it was the instrument, and the reading was always the same. I tested it the way I'd test anything. I walked the loop at different times of day, thinking light. Same. I walked it having deliberately filled my mind with other things, thinking suggestion. Same, it would ambush me out of my distraction the instant I came in view of the gap. I walked it with a friend once, not telling him anything, and watched him, and as we passed the gap, he stopped talking mid-sentence and looked at it, and then walked on and picked his sentence back up, and never said anything, and I never asked. But I saw him feel it too. The thing he didn't have a word for, and I did but wouldn't say. I kept notes. I want to admit that because it tells you something about me and about how I tried to hold the thing at arm's length. I kept a little log, dates, conditions, the strength of the sensation, on a scale I made up, 1 to 5, the way you'd log any phenomenon you were trying to characterize. For months. And the log is the most unsettling document I own, because it's so calm, so orderly, page after page of an old engineer's neat hand recording the intensity of being watched by something in a hole in the rocks, with notes on temperature and time of day, and whether the watching seems stronger in certain weather, as though I could measure my way to safety, as though if I just gathered enough data, the thing would resolve into something explainable and lose its power over me. It never did. The data was perfectly consistent and explained nothing. And I came to see eventually that the log was not really science. It was a ritual. It was a frightened man doing the one thing he knew how to do in the face of something his whole method couldn't touch, the way another man might pray. I'd built a career on the faith that anything real can be measured and anything measured can be understood. And the gap let me measure it all I liked patiently for months, and stayed exactly as unexplained at the end as at the beginning. And I think that was its own kind of answer, its own quiet way of telling me that my method had an edge to it, and that I had finally found the edge, and that the edge had been sitting beside my morning walk the whole time. I never saw anything. I want to be clear about that because I know the question. In all the times, I never once saw eyes or shape or movement in the gap. I only ever felt the watching, the attention, coming out of that dark space, steady and patient and old, with no malice in it that I could detect, and no friendliness either, just attention. The flat regard of something that had been there a very long time and would be there a very long time after. Watching the small, warm creatures go up and down the trail it lived beside. I'll tell you the one time it was different, and then I'll stop because it's the reason I quit the trail. One winter morning, early, hardly light snow on the ground, I came up the trail toward the gap, and the watching landed on me as always, and then, for the only time in all those years, it changed. The attention sharpened. It went from the flat regard of something noticing weather to something focused, something interested and into my head, not as a sound, not as words exactly, but as a kind of pressure shaped like a thought, came an invitation. I can't describe it better than that. The thing in the gap, for the first and only time, was no longer just watching me pass. It wanted me to come in. It wanted me to step off the trail and into the gap, and into the dark between the rocks. And the wanting was patient and certain and absolutely without hurry, as if it had decided after 1,000 mornings of watching me go by that it was finally time to ask, and that it had all the time in the world for me to say yes. I did one more thing, the engineer in me, before I let it go entirely. I looked into the trail, the history of it, the way I'd research a site before a build. And the trail is old, older than the park designation. An old route through that country, and before that, the map suggested, an even older route. A way people had moved through those mountains for a very long time because it follows the only sensible line through that terrain, the way trails do, the path of least resistance that everyone finds eventually, and the rockfall, the jumble of boulders with the gap in it. I found a single reference to, in an old account, a settler-era account of that area that mentioned the place by a descriptive name, the Talking Rocks, and noted in passing in the dry way those old accounts have, that the local native people would not camp near it and advised against lingering there, and that one of the party had gone to investigate the gap in the rocks against this advice and had been, the account said, troubled afterward, and had left the party early to return home. Troubled afterward. The same words near enough that I'd used for the young man in another of your stories. For anyone who'd put a hand or a foot or an ear too close to one of these waiting things. I sat with that old account a long time because it meant the thing in the gap had been asking people in for a very long time. Since before the trail was a park trail, since before it was a settler trail, since it was just the way through, and that it had watched a great many feet go by over a great many years, and asked now and then, very gently, and that the only ones who'd had trouble were the ones who went to investigate, who answered the asking, and that the rest, the thousands who just walked the path of least resistance through their ordinary lives, had passed within arm's reach of it forever and been let alone, watched but not troubled, because they kept walking, the path of least resistance. I built my life on understanding that phrase, in steel and concrete, the way forces want to travel. I never thought I'd find it written into the oldest danger in those mountains, that the safe ones are the ones who keep moving along the easy line, and the troubled ones are the ones who stop and turn aside and go to sea. I did not go in. I walked past faster than I'd ever walked it, and I went home, and I never walked that trail again. I'm too old to be testing invitations from dark places, and I've thought since about all those mornings of being watched, and I've come to believe it wasn't malevolent, that whatever's in that gap doesn't hunt, doesn't lunge, doesn't chase. It waits. It watches the same creatures pass for years, patient as stone. And at some point, by some logic I can't fathom, It decides one of them is ready, and it asks just once, very gently, and it leaves the answer entirely up to you. And I think that's the most frightening kind of thing there is. Not the thing that chases you, the thing that simply waits beside the path of your ordinary life for years, patient and unhurried, until the morning it decides to ask if you'd like to come in. It means you no harm by asking, and will accept whatever you answer. And that is exactly why you must be the kind of person who keeps walking, because it will not stop you. It will only ask. And the going in, if you go in, will be entirely your own doing. Story 12. My grandmother raised me mostly, and she came up from Mexico as a young woman and brought her stories with her. And there was one she told me that I never believed until I had my own version of it, out in the agricultural valley, where I drove a truck for the big farms for many years. I'll tell you hers first, short, because mine doesn't make sense without it. She grew up in a farming village, and she said that out in the fields at night, in the time between the last light and full dark, the dusk, there was a thing you did not do, which was answer if you heard a baby crying out in the rows. She said everyone knew it. A baby crying in the fields at dusk, far from any house where no baby could be. And if you went to it thinking to save it, it would not be a baby, and you would not come back. Or you would come back wrong. She called it by a name I won't try to spell, and she said it cried like a baby because a crying baby is the one sound a person cannot walk away from. That we are built, all of us, down in the oldest part of us, to go toward a crying child. And that the thing in the fields knew this and used it. That it had always used it. That it was older than the village and older than the people in it. I thought it was just a story to keep kids out of the fields at night. And I should say my grandmother had 100 such stories. And I'd put this one in the same drawer as all the rest. The drawer where you keep the things the old people say that you nod at and don't believe. She had a way of telling it though, this one, different from the others. The other she'd tell at the table, lively with her hands to entertain. This one she'd only tell when it was getting dark, and she'd tell it quiet. And she'd watch your face while she told it to make sure it was going in. And at the end she wouldn't laugh the way she did with the others. She'd just look at you and say, "You remember that," and wait until you said, "Yes, Grandma, I'll remember." As a boy, I thought that was just her being dramatic. As a man, I understand she was doing the most important thing she knew how to do, which was load a piece of survival into a child, too young to know he'd need it. The way you'd teach a child not to touch the stove, except the stove was a thing in the fields that she couldn't point to or prove. So she had to do it with a story, and stories were the tool she had, and she used it on me as carefully as a doctor. I drove truck in the big valley for 20 years, hauling produce, and I was out at all hours on the farm roads between the fields, the endless flat fields that go to the horizon, and I never thought about my grandmother's story until the night I heard it. I'd stopped on a farm road at dusk, pulled over to check a tire I thought was going soft, and I was crouched down at the wheel in that last purple light with the fields stretching out all around me, quiet, the way the valley gets quiet in the evening. And I heard a baby crying. I should tell you about that hour, the dusk, in the valley, because my grandmother had been specific about it, and standing there, I understood why. It's a strange hour out in the big fields. The light goes flat and purple, and the heat of the day lifts off, and there's this stillness. The workers gone home, the birds settled, the irrigation gone quiet, and the rows go off in every direction to the horizon, perfectly straight, perfectly even. And there's something about all those endless straight lines fading into the dusk that already does something to your mind. It makes the place feel less like dirt and crops and more like a vast, quiet room that's waiting for something. My grandmother had said it was the in-between time, not day and not night, and that the in-between time was when the in-between things could come close. And standing there at my truck in that purple light, before I even heard the crying, I'd felt the hair on my neck, felt the wrongness of the hour, the way the whole flat world seemed to be holding still and listening. And I'd told myself it was nothing, just the quiet, just being tired, just an old man's granddaughter remembering an old woman's stories. And then the crying started out in the rows, and every story my grandmother ever told me stood up at once. Out in the rows. Off to my right, out in a field of something low and leafy, away from the road, away from any house. And there are no houses out in those fields. The workers come and go. Nobody lives out in the middle of the rows. And it was a baby. Not a cat, not a bird. I know those sounds. I've heard a bobcat scream, and it doesn't sound like this. This was a human infant, crying. The real thing, that specific cry that goes straight past your thinking and grabs something in your chest and pulls. And I stood up from the tire and I took a step toward it before I even knew I was doing it. That's the part that frightens me still. My body started toward that sound before my mind had any say. One step off the road toward the field, because there was a baby crying, and you go to a crying baby, that's not a decision. That's what a person is. And my grandmother's voice came up in me. Not like I remembered it, like she was saying it right then. Do not answer the crying in the fields. And I stopped with one foot off the road, and I stood there, and the crying went on. And it got more. It got more like a baby, more pitiful, more urgent. As if it had felt me stop and was working harder, pulling harder, and I understood in my body what my grandmother had meant. That it was using the sound on me like a hook, adjusting it, and that the better it sounded, the more real and more desperate, the more I should not go. I got back in my truck. The soft tire would have to wait. And I sat in the cab with the doors locked and the crying coming through the glass. Out there in the dark rows, and I did not go to it, and after a while, a long while, it stopped. And this is the thing that made me drive away on the soft tire and never stop on that road at dusk again. After it stopped, something in the field laughed. Not a baby. A low sound, brief, satisfied almost. The sound of something setting down a tool that didn't work this time. And then nothing, and I drove away with my tire thumping, and I did not look at the fields. I called my grandmother that night. She was very old by then, and I told her, and she didn't say I told you so. She just got very quiet, and then she asked me, did you answer it? And I said no. And she let out a breath and she said, good, you remembered. And then she told me the part she'd never told me when I was a boy. Because you don't tell a boy the worst part. She said her own brother, my great uncle, had answered it when they were young, had gone out into the rows at dusk after a crying baby, and had been found 2 days later miles away, alive, but never able to speak again. Not one word for the rest of his life. A grown man who lived another 50 years and never spoke. And that the family understood he had been made to leave his words out in the field. That the thing had taken his voice as the price of letting him come back. And that this was a mercy, because most who answered don't come back at all. I went and found my great uncle's grave after my grandmother passed. The brother who'd lost his words in the field. I'd never met him. He died before I was born, but I found where he was buried back in the old part of a cemetery in the valley, and I stood there a while. And an old man tending the graves nearby, seeing me at that stone, came over, the way old men in small valley towns do, and asked, was that my people? And I said, yes, my great uncle. And the old man looked at the dates, and he said, ah, the one who didn't talk. You're from that family. And I said, you knew him? And the old man said, everybody around here knew of him. The man who went out in the fields as a boy and came back without his words and lived his whole long life that way. And that there were others, before and after. That it wasn't only my family. That the valley had a quiet history of it. Children and sometimes grown people who went out towards something at dusk and came back wrong or didn't come back. And that the old families all had the rule, in Spanish or in English or in the languages from before either. The same rule, you don't answer the crying in the fields. And he told me the part that stayed with me. He said the reason it takes the voice, when it takes anything, when it lets you come back at all, is that the voice is how you answered it. You opened your mouth toward it. You made the sound that said, "Here I am. I'm coming." And so the voice is what it takes, the part of you that answered. And that's why my great uncle never spoke again, not because his throat was hurt, but because the answering part of him was gone, given, left out in the rows. And the old man said, "The ones who keep the rule keep their voices." And that's the whole of it. And then he went back to his graves, and I stood with my great uncle a while longer, the boy who answered. And then I drove home and called my own grandchildren just to hear them talk. I'm old now myself. I tell this story to my own grandchildren. And they look at me the way I looked at my grandmother, like it's a quaint old thing, a story to scare kids. And that's fine. I don't need them to believe it now. I just need it in them, down in the deep place where my grandmother's voice was in me. So that someday, if they're ever out somewhere lonely at dusk and they hear a baby crying where no baby could be, and their body starts to take that first step toward it, something their old abuelo told them surfaces and stops their foot before it leaves the road. That's all I want. You do not answer the crying in the fields. You get in the truck and you lock the door and you wait for it to give up. And you drive away on the soft tire and you keep your voice and you go home. A quick word. Call to action 3 of 3. A few stories left, and they're among the strongest in the inbox, so stay with me. Before we get into them, if this channel has become part of your routine, the late night listen, the long drive, the thing playing while you do the dishes, the single best thing you can do is share one episode with one person who'd appreciate it. That's how channels like this one keep the lights on. Thank you for being here. Let's finish. Story 13. I was a hotshot for 9 seasons. Wildland Fire. And if you don't know what that is, a hotshot crew is the ground troops of the big fires. 20 people who hike into the backcountry with chainsaws and hand tools and dig line. Cut fuel breaks. Do the brutal physical work of trying to put an edge on a fire where there's no road and no engine can reach. It is the hardest work I have ever done, or ever will, and I loved it the way you love a thing that nearly kills you. And I worked fires all over the state, the big ones, the ones you saw on the news, and I saw a lot of things out there that civilians never see. Fire behavior that doesn't seem possible, country burned to the moon, the aftermath, all of it. So I've got a high bar for strange. Fire is already strange, but there's one thing from one fire that sits outside everything else. And the crew that was there, the few I've talked to since, we don't really talk about it, but we all remember it the same. And that sameness is why I finally decided to write it down. You have to understand what a crew is first, or none of it lands right. 20 people who spend a season hiking and digging and sleeping in the dirt together do not stay strangers. You know each other. You know each other's voices in the dark without looking. You know the way each person calls out, the way one guy always says copy and another always says, got it. You know it, the way you know your family's footsteps in the house. That's not sentiment, it's survival. Because on the line in the smoke and the dark and the roar, with your visibility shot and the radio crackling, your ears and your knowledge of your crew are how you stay alive, how you keep accountability, how you know that the shape moving in the smoke beside you is your guy and not a problem. The whole thing runs on knowing each other's voices, and I lay it out like that so you understand why what happened that night was so deep a violation, why it got into us the way it did, because it didn't come at us as a monster or a noise in the dark. It came at us wearing the voices we trusted most in the world, the voices we'd staked our lives on knowing, and used exactly that knowing against us. It was a big fire in the mountains, a bad one, late season, burning in steep timber country a long way from anything. We'd hiked in deep, and we were working a section of line on a ridge night shift, because sometimes you work the fire at night when it lays down a little, and the humidity comes up. Night fire is its own world. You've got your headlamps, you've got the orange glow of the fire down the slope. You've got the dark timber all around and you're strung out along the line. 20 of us, each working our piece. The chainsaw's going, the scrape of tools, calling out to each other. It's loud, it's lit by firelight, it's chaos with a structure to it. I should say something about what a fire does to a place, to your sense of a place, because I think it's part of why that country was open to whatever came. A big fire at night is the most disorienting environment I know. The light is wrong, everything lit from below and from the side by moving orange light, shadows leaping and swinging, and the noise is constant. The fire itself roars. It's not a campfire crackle. A running fire is a freight train, a roar that fills everything. And on top of it, the saws and the wind. The fire makes its own weather. Fire pulls air, it breathes, and the smoke comes and goes. So one minute you can see the whole slope, and the next you're in a brown dark that stings your eyes and you can't see the person 10 feet away. In all that, your crew is the only fixed thing, the voices, the known shapes, and you cling to them. And I've come to think a fire tears something open in a place, not just burns it, that you've got country that's maybe never had a person in it. Sure never had it lit up and roaring at night, and you come in with your saws and your fire and you rip the night open. And in all that chaos and wrong light and roar, the edges of things get thin. And something that's always been out there in that dark timber finds it can come closer than it usually can move among the leaping shadows in the smoke, can be one more yellow-shirted shape in the chaos. Because on a night like that, nobody can quite see anybody clearly, and that's exactly the cover it needs. And sometime in the middle of that night, the calls started coming down the line that didn't belong. Here's how a crew works. You're spread out. You can't always see the person up or down the line from you. So you pass information by voice, you call it down the line, and it relays person to person. Need a saw up here. Taking a break in 5. Squad boss wants you. Normal stuff passed hand to hand down a line of 20 people in the dark. And that night, mixed in with the normal calls, there started to be other ones. A voice would call down the line, and it would be a name, one of ours, calling for them by name, saying, "Come up here," or "Come down here. We need you off the line." Into the dark, away from the work. And at first that's normal, people get called off the line for things. But it started to be wrong. The voices calling didn't match. Somebody down at the bottom of the line would hear my squad boss's voice calling a guy up, clear as anything, the squad boss's exact voice, and pass it along. And the guy would go up, and the squad boss would have never called him, would be surprised to see him, would say, "I never called you. Get back on your piece." And it kept happening up and down the line, all night. Voices that sounded exactly like our crew leaders, calling people off into the dark, by name. And the names were right, the voices were right, and none of the calls were real. Something was, calling our people off the line in the voices of the people they trusted, trying to peel us off one at a time into the black timber away from the light and the group. It took us a while to understand it because it's chaos out there, and the natural assumption is miscommunication. The line's long, things get garbled. But the squad bosses started to clock it. The calls were being attributed to them that they never made, and they got on the radios, the actual radios, and started confirming everything. No moving off the line without a radio confirmation from a known voice. And once they did that, once there was a way to check, the fake calls didn't stop, but they stopped working because now when you heard the squad boss's voice call you up, you'd key your radio and say, "Confirm you want me up." And the radio would crackle back, "No, I didn't call you. Hold your position." And you'd know the voice in the dark was the liar. But here's the part. We did a count, the way you do. Accountability, you count your people constantly on a fire. Your life depends on knowing where 20 people are. And partway through the night, the count came up 21. Somebody counted 21 of us on the line. And then the next count was 20, correct? And then 21 again. And the squad bosses are going crazy trying to figure out who's the extra, or who's the miscount. And in the firelight, in the dark, and the chaos with everybody in the same gear, same yellow shirts and green pants, the same helmets and headlamps, faces smudged black with soot. It is genuinely hard to be sure. You know your crew. But in that light at a glance, everybody looks like everybody. And there was a stretch of that night where we could not get a clean count, where there kept being one too many, where somewhere in our line of 20, there was a 21st working alongside us in the dark, cutting and scraping and looking just like us, and calling, I'm certain of it, calling our names in our leaders' voices, trying to walk us off one by one into the timber. We got the count right by bringing everybody in tight, all 20, headlamps on faces, name by name, everybody looking at everybody. And when we did that, when we made the line into a tight circle of known faces all confirming each other, the count came 20 in, stayed 20, and the fake calls stopped, all at once, the moment we were all together and looking at each other and could no longer be peeled apart. And we held that tight for the rest of the night, no one alone, no one off the line without two people watching them go and come back. And nothing else happened, and at dawn we hiked out, and the day crew took over, and we never worked that section again, because the fire moved. And so did we. I want to tell you what the dawn looked like. Hiking out because it stays with me as the other side of the night. We came down off the ridge in the early gray light, the fire still burning but lower, the way a fire goes quiet in the morning damp. And we walked down through what the fire had already been through, the black country, the standing dead trees, the smoking duff under your boots. And it was beautiful and terrible the way burned country is. Everything stripped to its bones, the whole hillside revealed in a way it never is when it's alive and leafed out. And I thought about the night, about the 21st that moved in the smoke and the wrong voices down the line, and I thought about how fire does that, how it reveals things, burns off the surface and shows you the structure underneath, and how that applies to more than just the trees. We'd been stripped down that night too, stripped of everything except the count, the 20 known faces, the confirmed voices, and what was left when the surface burned away was exactly that. The thing that matters, which is knowing your people and staying tight and not going off alone no matter whose voice calls for you. Because that's the whole of it. That's the thing, the fire and the thing in the fire both taught me. You can lose a lot out there in the dark and the smoke. You cannot lose the count. You keep the count and you go home, and everything else, the fear and the strangeness and the voice with your name, you let burn. The hotshot I was talking to at that reunion, the one who brought up the young man's name, he said something at the end of the conversation that I've thought about a lot since. He said the old heads who told him about the fire waking things, that those men had a phrase for it, for what the thing was that moved in the smoke and called names. And the phrase was the 21st, always. That's what they called it. Because it was always one too many, one extra that appeared in the count when something was wrong. And he said the old heads had been using that phrase for decades, which meant it had happened before, on other fires, to other crews. One too many moving in the smoke and wearing the voices of leaders, calling the young ones off the line. One extra that vanished when you got tight and counted right. He said it had a name among them, and it was always the same name. The 21st. I don't know if that's comforting or not, having a name for it. It meant we weren't the first. It also meant we weren't the last. I'll tell you the detail that none of us talked about for years. The one that took the longest to come out because it came out only once. Late. Between me and another guy from that crew. Both of us a few beers in, at a reunion of sorts. The kind of thing fire people have. We were talking around it the way we do, and he said, "Real quiet, you remember the count?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "You ever think about whose name got called the most?" And I hadn't, not consciously, but the second he said it, I knew. And so did he. We both knew without saying it. There was one guy on the crew that night, a young guy, first season, good kid, and his name was the one that kept coming down the line in the wrong voices, more than anybody's. The squad boss's voice calling him. The captain's voice calling him over and over. Come up here, come down here, off the line, into the dark. It wanted him. For whatever reason, out of 20 of us, it had picked him. It kept calling for him specifically. And the reason we got tight and confirmed every call and never let anybody go off alone was really, though nobody said it at the time, to keep it from getting him. And the thing the other guy told me, the thing that I think is the real reason neither of us ever brought it up, is that young guy, the one it called for all night, he didn't make it through the next season. Not on our crew, he'd transferred to another one, and there was an accident, the kind that happens. A tree, a widowmaker, the things that kill fire people. And it was ruled exactly what it looked like, an accident, because that's what it was. But the two of us sitting there with our beers, we both did the same math, that the thing in the dark had called his name all night, and we'd kept it from him that night. And then a year later, somewhere else on a different fire in a different country, something had finally gotten him after all. And we couldn't help thinking it was the same thing, that it had marked him that night and waited, patient, the way these things are patient, until he was on a line where the rest of us weren't there to keep him tight. And then it had called him off one more time, and that time there'd been no one to confirm the call. I don't know if that's true. It's probably not. Trees fall on fire crews. It's the job. It's the most ordinary, terrible thing in the world. But I think about it. I think about how it called his name all night and we saved him, and how maybe you don't get saved from a thing like that. You just get to pick the year. I've talked to maybe 4 other guys from that crew over the years, ran into them at other fires or after, and every one of them remembers it the same way. The calls in the wrong voices, the count coming up 21. The way it stopped when we got tight together. We don't have an explanation. Wildland fire people are not as a rule superstitious. We're too practical. The job's too real. But there's a thing the old heads say, the ones who've been doing it 30 years, that the fire brings things or wakes things, and the country it burns through. That a big fire is a kind of disturbance that's not just physical, that you're out there in country that's never seen a human at night, and you've set part of it on fire, and something notices. And the old heads say, you keep your crew together and you confirm your calls, and you never ever go off alone into the black on the word of a voice, no matter whose voice it is, because the fire is awake and so is whatever the fire woke, and it has learned your voices, and it is calling your name. Story 14. I'm a retired county sheriff's deputy, and I patrolled a rural high desert region for most of my career. The kind of county that's mostly empty, a few small towns, and a lot of nothing in between. Joshua trees and dry lake beds and dirt roads going off to mines and homesteads long abandoned. It's beautiful country, and it's hard country, and people disappear into it, sometimes on purpose, and sometimes not. And a good part of the job out there is knowing the difference. I've written up a lot of strange things and a lot of reports over the years. Because strange things happen where there's a lot of empty and not many people. But most of them had explanations if you dug drugs or domestic trouble or somebody who wanted to vanish. One of them never did, and it's the one I'm sending you. And I've changed the names and a few details because some of the people are still living. There was a stretch of road in my patrol area, a state route running across a big dry valley, dead straight for miles. The kind of road where you can see headlights coming for 10 minutes before they reach you. And on that road, over the course of about 2 years, we had a cluster of single vehicle accidents, cars off the road, that didn't add up. Not a lot, maybe 5 or 6, but more than that road should have had, because it was straight and flat and dry. Nothing to hit, no curves to misjudge, the easiest road in the county to drive. And the accidents all had the same shape. A driver alone at night would put their car off the road, hard, into the desert. And the ones who survived all said some version of the same thing. That they'd swerved to avoid a person standing in the road. I sat with a few of those survivors taking statements, and I wanted to describe what that was like. because it's part of what got under my skin. These were not hysterical people. By the time I talked to them, they were past the shock, banged up, embarrassed mostly, the way people are after a wreck they can't fully explain. And they'd all started on their own to talk themselves out of what they'd seen the way people do. One of them, a rancher, a hard, practical man, told me the whole thing flat and factual. The figure in the road, the swerve, and then at the end he sort of laughed and said, "Of course there was nobody there. Must have been a shadow, a tumbleweed, I don't know." And I could see him wanting me to agree, wanting me to give him the ordinary explanations so he could close the door on it. And I almost did. That's my job in a way, to write down tumbleweed and close the file. But I'd taken enough of these statements by then to have noticed the thing they didn't notice, which was that they all described it the same: the height, the too tall, the facing them. And people who've seen a tumbleweed or a shadow don't independently describe the same specific wrong thing. So I'd nod and let them have their tumbleweed and write it up plain, and then go home and not sleep, because I knew it wasn't tumbleweeds. I had 5 or 6 people who'd never met each other, all describing the same too tall figure standing in the same stretch of road. And that's not a thing you can file under shadow, no matter how much everybody, me included, wanted to. A person standing in the road at night, out in the middle of the dead straight empty stretch, where there was no reason for anyone to be on foot, miles from any house. The drivers would come over a little rise, the only rise on that stretch. And there in their headlights would be somebody standing in their lane, and they'd swerve and off the road they'd go. And we never found anybody. No pedestrian, no body, no one reported hurt or missing who'd have been out there walking. Just driver after driver swearing they'd swerved to miss a person who wasn't there when we arrived and never had been. I worked several of those wrecks, and I'll tell you, the survivors were not drunk mostly, and they were not the type to make things up. They were ranch hands and traveling salesmen and a school teacher, ordinary people badly shaken. And they all described the figure the same way without prompting, which is the thing that got me. Because when people make things up or misremember, they describe things differently. These descriptions matched. A figure standing in the lane, facing the oncoming car, not waving, not trying to flag them down, just standing, facing them. And every one of them said the same detail that I'd never put in the reports because there was no box for it. That the figure was too tall. That it stood in the lane and it was too tall to be a person. That the headlights hit it and it was a person's shape but stretched wrong in the height. And that the wrongness of the height was what made them swerve as much as the figure being there at all. That some part of them saw the height and knew it had to get away from it and yanked the wheel. I decided finally to see for myself, off the books, my own time. I parked out on that stretch one night, up on the little rise, lights off, and I waited, because if somebody was out there messing with drivers, standing in the road, I was going to catch them. And I sat out there in the dark for hours, several nights across a couple of weeks. And most nights, nothing, just the occasional car going by straight and fine. And I started to feel foolish. I'll say that before I went out there myself, I'd talked to one old deputy, retired by then, who'd worked that area decades before me, because his name was on some of the oldest reports I'd pulled. I drove out to his place and sat on his porch and asked him about the road, and he knew exactly what I meant before I'd half finished asking. He said they'd had a run of it in his day too. The swerving wrecks, the figure, too tall, and that he'd done more or less what I was thinking of doing, gone out to watch. And I asked him what happened, and he got quiet. And he said he'd seen it once far off, and that he'd never gone back. That he'd decided some things you don't investigate. You just warn people away from and let lie. And he looked at me hard and he said, "You're going to go out there anyway, aren't you? I can see it. You're the type." And I said, "I expect I am." And he said, "Then take every light you own and don't you dare get out of the car. Whatever you see, don't get out of the car and drive at it. Don't drive away. Away is what it wants. And I thought he was an old man being colorful. I know now he was passing me the one piece of knowledge that kept me alive out there. The same way the freight drivers passed it. The same way I'd pass it after, drive at it. All your lights. Don't get out. He'd carried it 40 years to hand it to me on a porch. I'm glad I listened. And then one night I saw it. Not in the road. I want to be precise because I've thought about this every day since. I was parked facing down the long, straight stretch, and far down the road, at the limit of where I could see in the moonlight, something stepped up out of the desert onto the road, from the side. It came up out of the dark, flat desert onto the pavement, and it stood in the lane facing away from me, down the road the other way, waiting. And even at that distance, even in just moonlight, I could see that the drivers were right, that it was too tall, that it stood in that lane at a height no person stands, and that it was waiting for headlights, that it had come up onto the road because it had felt or heard or somehow known that a car was coming. And sure enough, a minute later, headlights appeared way down at the far end coming toward it, toward me, and the thing in the road stood and faced them and waited. I did the only thing I could think to do. I hit my lights, my reds and blues, the full bar, and my headlights. And I laid on the horn, and I started driving toward it, fast, because there was a car coming that was going to swerve and crash, and I had to break it up, but I had to get that thing out of the road. And the second my lights hit, the reds and blues, the thing in the road turned all the way around toward me. And I got it full in my headlights for just a second, just 1 second, at maybe 100 yards in closing, and I'm not going to describe the face, because I've spent 20 years trying not to, except to say that it had been built to look like a person, and whoever or whatever built it had gotten everything almost right, and the almost is the thing that's lived behind my eyes ever since. And then it stepped back off the road, down into the desert on the side, smooth, one step and gone, down into dark that my headlights should have lit up and didn't. And the oncoming car went by me straight and safe and fine, the driver never even slowing, never having seen a thing, because I'd broken it up. I'd gotten there with my lights before the thing could set itself for them. I did one thing before I retired that I never told anybody. I pulled the old records for that stretch of road, going back as far back as the county had them, because I wanted to know if it was new, the accidents, or if it was old. And it was old. It went back as far as the paper went. Not every year, but in clusters every so often. A run of single vehicle wrecks on that one straight dry stretch. Drivers swerving to miss something that wasn't there. Going back decades. Back before my time. Back before the road was even paved. When it was a dirt route across the valley, and the wrecks were wagons and early automobiles. And the descriptions, where there were any, were always the same, near enough. A figure in the road, too tall. And in the oldest records before the county, there were just the stories, the kind that get written down in the local histories, that the valley road was bad luck after dark, that the old freight drivers wouldn't push through that stretch at night if they could help it, that there was a thing that stood in the road, always the same stretch, the straight part by the little rise, where you can see headlights coming for 10 minutes. And I understood, looking at all those decades of wrecks, that I hadn't stopped anything. I'd interrupted it one night while with my lights, and the cluster I was working had ended. But it had ended before, lots of times. The clusters always ended eventually, and then years later started again. And it would start again after me, after I was gone, after everybody who remembered was gone. Because the thing in the road isn't in a hurry and doesn't need to be. It's got the one trick, and it's got forever to run it. A figure in the road, too tall, and the driver's hands yanking the wheel before their mind can catch up. I left a note in the file. Not an official one, just a note. For whatever deputy might someday pull those records working a fresh cluster. Telling them what I'd seen and what I'd done about it. The lights, driving at it instead of away. Whether anybody ever reads it, I don't know. but it seemed important that there be something in the record besides accident, accident, accident that somebody who came after might find. The way the old freight drivers left their stories for whoever came after them. Drive at it with all your lights on. It's in the file now, in a country deputy's hand for the next one. The accidents on that stretch stopped after that. I don't know why. Maybe coincidence. Maybe whatever it was moved on. Maybe it didn't like being seen full on by a man with a light bar who drove at it instead of away. I never told anybody at the department what I saw, because what would I say? I never put it in a report. I just quietly started telling the other deputies that if anybody wrecked on that stretch, swerving to miss a pedestrian, to take it seriously, to look hard but not too long, and to never ever stop and get out and walk into the desert after a figure that stepped off the road, no matter how much it looked like a person who needed help. A couple of them gave me looks. A couple of them. The ones who'd worked that road didn't, just nodded, because they'd felt something out there too. And I want to say one last thing about what it felt like to drive at it, because people always ask about that when I've come close enough to describing this to anyone. And the answer is not what you'd expect. I wasn't brave. I want to be clear about that. I hit the lights and I floored it and my hands were shaking the whole way. But there's a thing about going toward a thing instead of away from it, even when you're terrified, that changes the quality of the fear. When you're running from something, the fear is in charge. It's got the wheel. All you're doing is trying to get away. And the faster you go, the bigger it gets behind you. When you go toward it, the fear is still there. It's enormous. But you're in charge. You've made a decision and you're executing it. And the thing ahead of you is now a problem you're solving, rather than a monster you're fleeing. And that difference between fleeing and solving is the whole of what the training meant when they said, drive toward the trouble. It doesn't make you not afraid. It just puts you back in your own cab, with your hands on your own wheel, instead of letting the fear steer. And that thing in the road, whatever it was, I believe it was counting on the fear to steer, that it had stood in that road for decades knowing drivers would flinch and yank the wheel and go off into the desert. Because that's what fear does to a driver. And that the one thing it didn't have a plan for was someone who drove at it anyway. Lights on, bearing down, making it be the one that stepped aside. Maybe that's all of anything like that needs. Just one person who decides to drive toward it instead of away, who gives the fear a job and keeps both hands on the wheel. Here's what I think. For whatever a country deputy's thinking is worth, I think that thing learned that a person standing in a road at night makes a car swerve, and that a swerving car at speed on a straight desert road goes off into the dark where help is a long way away. And I think it stood in that road over and over, patient, working that one simple trick. And I think it wasn't standing there to be missed. I think the swerve was the point. I think it was harvesting in its slow way off that road, one car at a time. And the only thing that ever interrupted it was a man who came at it with every light he had instead of turning away. They told us in training that you drive toward the trouble, that's the job. Everybody else gets to flee and you go toward it. I never thought that training would be the thing that saved a stranger's life from something I still don't have a name for. But you drive toward it with all your lights on. That's the whole of what I learned out there. Whatever's standing in the road wants you to turn the wheel, so don't. Light it up and bear down on it and make it be the one that steps off the road. Story 15. This is the last one I'll ever tell about it, and I'm giving it to you instead of to anyone I know, because the people I know are tired of it, and because you read these plainly without making them into a circus. I spent 32 years as a backcountry ranger in one of the big Sierra parks, the high country, the granite and the lakes and the passes. And I've patrolled wilderness that most people will only ever see in photographs, on foot and on horseback, alone for days and weeks. I have slept more nights at altitude under the open sky than almost anyone alive. And I say that not to boast, but so you'll weigh what I tell you against it. Because in 32 years, of nights in the high wilderness, I saw exactly one thing I cannot explain. One, and everything else, every light and sound and track, I could account for, because I knew that country down to the granite. One thing I couldn't. And here it is, plain, and then I'm done carrying it alone. There's a high basin I won't name, above 11,000 feet, a string of lakes in a granite bowl ringed by peaks, one of the most beautiful places on this earth, and one I patrolled for decades and loved beyond reason. There's an old trail through it and a few campsites, and in the high season you'd get backpackers. But in the shoulder seasons, late fall especially, after the crowds thinned and before the snow closed the passes, you could go days up there without seeing a soul. And those were the trips I lived for, the empty ones, the basin to myself. It was one of those late fall trips. I'd camped at the upper lake, alone, miles from the nearest other human. And it was one of those still cold nights at altitude where the sky is so thick with stars, it doesn't even look real and the lake goes dead calm, and the cold comes down hard with the dark. I'd had my dinner and I was sitting out, watching the stars before turning in, and the moon hadn't risen yet, so it was starlight only. That strange, bright starlight you get up high where the air is thin. Enough to see the pale shapes of the granite and the black mass of the peaks, but not much detail. I'd had thousands of nights like it, and I want to be clear about that because it matters. I was not a nervous camper. 32 years in the backcountry burns the nervousness out of you. Or it sends you to another line of work. I had slept alone beside that very lake dozens of times. I knew its sounds. The way the ice forms at the edges on the cold nights with that ticking, glassy sound. The way the rock fall up on the peaks lets go now and then with a distant clatter. The way the wind comes down off the passes in the small hours. I knew the country's whole vocabulary, and none of it frightened me, because I could name all of it. That's what being good at the job is. In the end, it's being able to name everything so that the dark holds nothing you can't account for. I'd taught younger rangers that fear in the backcountry is mostly the fear of the unnamed, and that once you can name the sounds, the night goes friendly. I believed it. I'd staked 32 years on it. And it was true, right up until the night it wasn't. The night the warm light came on across the lake. The one thing in all those years I couldn't name. And I learned what I'd been teaching the young ones was only true as far as it went. That the country's vocabulary has a word in it that isn't in the glossary, and that you don't want to be the one who learns it. And out across the lake, on the far shore, maybe a few hundred yards, a light came on. A small warm light, like a campfire or a lantern, low on the far shore. And my first reaction was just surprise, then a little professional irritation, because I'd have known if other backpackers were up here. You generally do. And there'd been no one at the trailhead register, and you're not supposed to have a fire up there above the tree line. There's nothing to burn anyway. And so my ranger brain went, who's that? And how'd they get past me? And they better not have a fire going. And I almost called out across the lake, almost hailed them, the way you do hello at the camp. But something stopped me before I did, and I've thanked whatever it was every day since. Because I looked at the light, really looked, and it was wrong. In the way the hydrologist's reflection was wrong if you've run that one on the channel, in a way that took a second to land. It didn't flicker. A fire flickers, a flame moves. Even a lantern flame moves a little and throws shadows that shift. This light was perfectly steady, a fixed warm glow on the far shore, unmoving, and it gave off no sound, and you can hear a camp across still water at altitude at night voices the clink of a pot. And there was nothing, just the steady, silent, warm light sitting on the far shore, where I knew there was no one and nothing, just granite and the black water and the cold. And then it began to come around the lake, toward me, not bobbing the way a lantern bobs when someone carries it walking, smooth, gliding, The light came along the far shore and started around the end of the lake, toward my side, smooth and steady and silent, at the pace of a slow walk. And as it came, it stayed exactly the same size, the same steady warmth. No swing, no bob, no footsteps, no sound. Just a warm light moving around the shore of a high lake in the dark, toward the one human being in 20 miles. And I sat absolutely frozen and watched it come. And every hair on my body was standing up. And the cold I felt was not the night's cold. I did what some deep part of me said to do, which was nothing. I did not call out. I did not turn on my own headlamp. I did not move. I sat dead still in the dark by my dead fire, and I made myself small and silent, and I watched that light come around the lake toward me. And I had the absolute conviction, the way you know things in the deep country at night, that the worst thing I could possibly do was make a sound or a light, was answer it, was let it know that the warm thing it was coming toward was awake and aware and there. So I sat, and I did not answer, and the light came around to my side of the lake and along the shore toward my camp, and it stopped. I think the reason I knew, the reason the deep part of me said be still, was something an old packer had told me decades before. My first season, an old man who'd spent his life with mules in that country, and who I'd written off at the time as a superstitious old-timer the way young men do. He'd told me around a fire that the high lakes had lights on them sometimes on the still cold nights, and that the lights were lonesome and they came to you, and that the only thing to do was sit quiet and not call to them, because, he said, and I never forgot the words even when I didn't believe them, a light that comes looking for company is not looking to give you any. I'd laughed it off, privately. 30 years later, I sat frozen by a dead fire, with that old man's voice in my head, doing exactly what he'd said, not calling to the lonesome light, and I understood that he hadn't been a superstitious old fool at all. He'd been doing what the rancher's grandfather did, and what my own warnings to the young rangers were a paler version of, passing along the one piece of knowledge that kept a person alive up there, in the only form it travels. An old man's words by a fire to a young man who won't understand them until the night he needs them. I owe that old packer my life. I never got to tell him. He was long gone by the time I knew it. Maybe 40 yards off. Down the shore at the edge of where I could see, it stopped and sat there, the steady, silent, warm glow, and I understood that it was doing what I was doing, waiting. That we were two things in the dark, each waiting for the other to move first. And I will tell you that I have faced bears and rockfall and lightning and a man with a gun in 32 years. And I have never been frightened the way I was frightened sitting still in the dark, 40 yards from that patient, silent light, because all of those other things were of this world and had reasons I understood, and this had no reason I understood. It only had patience, and the patience was the terror, the sense that it had all night, that it had all of time, that it would simply sit there glowing and wait for me to crack, to move, to make the sound that would tell it I was real and awake and afraid. I did not crack. I want to say I was brave, but it wasn't bravery. It was a kind of paralysis that happened to be the right thing. I sat frozen and silent and unmoving for what I later worked out was most of 2 hours, until the moon finally came up over the eastern peaks and put its cold light down into the basin. And the moment the moonlight touched the shore where the light sat, the light was simply not there anymore. No fade, no going out. The moon came up and lit the shore, and there was no light, and no source for it, and no sign anything had ever been there. Just bare granite and the black water lapping, and the basin was empty, and it was just me, and the stars, and the risen moon, alone at the upper lake the way I'd been all along. I'll tell you what made me certain in the end, because for years, I tried to stay unsure. It was more comfortable unsure. After I retired, I had occasion to look back through the old incident records for that part of the park. The searches, the lost hikers, the ones who didn't come back, the way you do when you've got time and a thing eating at you. And I plotted them, where people went missing over the decades in that wilderness, the ones never found, the ones written up as fell, exposure, lost. And there's a cluster at that basin, at those lakes, more than there should be, more than the terrain or the traffic accounts for. A quiet, steady scatter of people across the years who went up to that beautiful high basin, often alone, often in the shoulder seasons, and were never seen again, written up every time as the mountains doing what the mountains do, because the mountains do kill people, and it's never hard to believe. But it was always that basin, always those lakes. And I thought about the warm light coming around the shore, patient, silent. And I thought about how many of those lost people had camped alone by that still water on a cold, clear night and seen a light come on across the lake where there was no one, and had done the natural thing, the human thing, the thing I almost did, had called out hello at the camp, had turned on their lamp, had walked down the shore to see who else was up here, to answer it, and had answered it. And I thought about how the only reason my name isn't in that cluster, the only reason, is that I sat still and small and silent and did not answer for 2 hours until the moon came up. The difference between the lost and the found up there is whether you answer. That's the whole of it. That's what the records say if you plot them. I never showed that plot to anyone. There's no one to show it to who could do anything with it. But I know it's there, the cluster at the lakes, going back as far as the records, all the people who answered the light. I broke camp at first light and I hiked out, and I did not patrol that basin alone again in the shoulder season. I always took someone, and I never told them why. I retired a few years later, and I've turned it over 10,000 times the way you do, looking for the ordinary answer. A lost backpacker with a headlamp, a reflection, a hallucination from the altitude and the solitude. And every one of them breaks on the same facts. A headlamp bobs and makes sound and casts a beam, and this glided and was silent and glowed without throwing a beam. A reflection doesn't come around a lake toward you. And altitude and solitude don't make a thing that waits 40 yards off for 2 hours, patient, silent, until the moon comes up and it goes. Here's the last of it, the thing I most need to say. I think the not answering is everything. I think that light has been coming around that lake toward whoever's camped alone there on the still cold nights for a very long time. Longer than the park, longer than the trail. And I think the ones who answer it, who call out, who turn on their light, who walk down the shore to see who's there, I think those are the ones who don't hike out in the morning. The ones who go in the registers as lost in the high country, fell, exposure, never found, the way people do up there, the way it's always explained. And I think the only ones who come back are the ones who sit still and small and silent and do not answer, and wait for the moon. So if you're ever camped alone by still water up high, and a warm light comes on across the lake, where you know there's no one, and it starts, smooth and silent, to come around toward you, do not answer it. Do not call out. Do not light your lamp. Do not go and see. Sit still. Be nothing. Wait for the moon. The light wants to know you're there. Don't tell it. That's all the submissions for tonight. Thank you to everyone who trusted this channel with what happened to them, the hard ones most of all. And thank you for staying with me to the end. If anything out there has ever made you stop and go still and decide not to answer, then you already understand the people you heard from tonight. Take care of yourself out there. Trust the old quiet part of you that knows things before you do, and I'll see you in the next one. This has been Park Ranger Files.